settle in. It is the morning of Friday, the 13th of October, in the year 1307. Before dawn, and I want you to notice that detail because everything in this story happens before dawn. The royal officers of Philip IV of France, the king they called Le Bel, the Fair, move through the sleeping kingdom with sealed orders in their satchels. The orders had been written weeks earlier and sent out under wax with the instruction that no man break the seal until the appointed hour. And at the appointed hour, in Paris and Rouen and Beaucaire, in the great fortified enclosures of the temple, with their towers and their granaries and their orchards, doors were knocked upon by men who did not wait for an answer. The knights inside did not resist. That is the first strange thing. These were the most feared soldiers in Christendom, men whose rule forbade them to retreat unless the odds were 3-1 against them, men who had held the passes of Palestine and died in the surf at Acre only 16 years before. And they put down nothing and picked up nothing. They came out into the cold October morning in their white mantles and let themselves be led away. And at the Paris temple, the Grand Master himself, Jacques de Molay, an old man from the Franche-Comté, who had spent his whole adult life in armor under a Levantine sun, walked out into the custody of a notary and a handful of sergeants. The day before, he had been a pallbearer at a royal funeral, walking beside the king. Now he was a prisoner of that same king, and he would remain a prisoner for the rest of his life. Some 5,000 men were taken across France in a single coordinated morning. It was, if you care for such details, one of the most efficient acts of state administration in the entire Middle Ages, and it was done in perfect silence, and nobody warned the order, and nobody has ever entirely explained why nobody warned the order. Then came the questions. Now, interrogations in the 14th century were not conversations. They were procedures. There was a list. The crown's lawyers, and behind them the Inquisitor of France, a Dominican named Guillaume de Paris, who happened also to be the king's personal confessor, had prepared a set of articles, eventually 127 of them, though the first sessions worked from a shorter list, and each article was a small closed door with only 2 possible answers behind it. Did you deny Christ at your reception into the order? Did you spit upon the cross? Were you kissed upon the base of the spine, the navel, the mouth? Were you told that the brothers might relieve their lust with one another, and that this was no sin? Did you wear a cord about your waist that had been wound about an idol? And then, again and again, in Paris, in Carcassonne, in Poitiers, in the Auvergne, from men who had never met one another and would never meet, came the article that made the notary's pens slow down. It concerned a head kept somewhere, brought out somewhere, adored somewhere. A head that was not the head of any saint the church had ever canonized in that form. And attached to that head, in some of the depositions, was a name. The scribes did not know how to spell it. That is one of my favorite pieces of evidence in this entire affair, and I will tell you why in a moment. They wrote Baphomet. They wrote Baphometi. They wrote Baphomet, Baphomet, Baphomets. It came out of the mouths of exhausted men in Occitan, and in bad Latin, and in the French of the North, and each clerk caught it as best he could, and set it down, and the ink dried, and the parchment was rolled and tied and carried to the royal archive, and it lay there. And the priests of the Inquisition, men who had spent their careers writing calmly about heretics, about Cathars who believed the world was made by an evil god, about Waldensians who preached without license, those men were frightened. You can feel it in the documents. There is a change of register. The prose goes stiff and pious and repetitive, the way people talk when they are trying not to think about what they are saying. So here is the question I want to leave lying on the floor between us, the way you leave a coin on a table and do not pick it up. If this name were nothing at all, if it were a scribal accident, a piece of legal theatre, a lawyer's invention scribbled to fill an article, then why has it not died? Names invented by lawyers die. They die within a generation. Nobody today fears the accusations leveled at the Guelphs, at the Fraticelli, at the memory of Pope Boniface VIII. But this one word crawled out of a rolled-up trial record in 1307, and it is still with us 700 years later. It is painted on album covers. It is carved on a bronze statue that has been carried by lorry from state to state in America, in and out of courthouse lawns. Nobody has ever let it rest. Something in it refuses to be finished. That is our story. Not did the Templars worship a devil. I will tell you honestly near the end of these 5 nights what I think the evidence supports. Our story is stranger and quieter than that. Our story is about how a word becomes a doorway, and what people have found on the other side of it, and what they brought back. Let us begin with the plainest thing, which is the record. Between October and November of 1307, in Paris alone, 138 brothers of the Temple were questioned. Of those, all but a handful confessed to something. That is a devastating figure, until you learn how it was obtained, and then it becomes a different kind of devastating. The methods were within the law of the time, which tells you something about the law of the time. Prolonged starvation, irons, the strappado, in which a man's wrists were tied behind him and he was hoisted from the ceiling by them, so that the whole weight of the body hung on the shoulder joints until they left their sockets. And the slow roasting of the feet, greased first with fat, so that they would take the heat properly. One brother, a man named Bernard de Vado, later told the Papal Commission that his heel bones had fallen out afterwards, and he brought the bones with him in a little box to show them. 36 men died in custody in Paris in the first weeks. That is the machinery that produced our 134 confessions, and any historian who quotes the number without the machinery is selling you something. And yet, and this is where the ground under us begins to feel less solid. Not every confession came out of the machine. Some men, brought before the Pope's own commissioners 2 and 3 years later, freely and without duress, repeated parts of the story. A reception ceremony with something odd in it. An object shown, a formula spoken. Some described a head with a beard. Some said it was made of gold, some of silver, some of gilded wood. Some said it was a painted panel and not a sculpture at all. Some said it had 2 faces, some 3. One man said it had 4 feet, 2 before and 2 behind, which is not a description of a head at all, and is one of the loveliest pieces of nonsense in the whole archive. Some said it was a cat, and the cat was gray or red or black, and it walked among the brothers at chapter and was reverenced. One knight said that when the idol was brought in, the demons came with it in the form of women. Another said flatly that he had never seen anything of the sort in 24 years in the order, and that he had been received in the ordinary way with the ordinary prayers, and that whoever said otherwise was lying, and he would say so under any torment they liked. Both of these men were telling the truth. That is the possibility I want you to hold, because it is the possibility almost nobody holds. It is quite possible for a witness to invent under pain, and for another witness to describe faithfully something he genuinely saw, and for both statements to end up on the same page of the same register in the same handwriting. The archive does not sort them for us. It never does. That is the work. Now the name itself, because the name is where the trail begins, and the name is a puzzle with a mundane solution and a beautiful one. And a good guide gives you both and tells you which is which. The mundane solution, and I will say plainly that it is the one most historians accept, and the one I would bet my own money on, is that Baphomet is a mangling of Muhammad, which is how medieval Europe said the name of the Prophet Muhammad. This is not speculation pulled from the air. We can watch the word being used that way before the trials ever happened. There is a letter written in 1098 at the siege of Antioch during the First Crusade by a Provençal crusader named Anselm of Ribemont, and in it he speaks of the enemy calling upon Baphomet in their towers, while the Christians called upon God. There are Occitan troubadour poems from the 12th century that use Baphomets the same way, a sneering shorthand for the faith of the Saracens. In the south of France, in the Languedoc, where a great many Templars came from, the word simply meant the God of the Muslims, understood by Christians wrongly and crudely as an idol. And that fits the accusation like a key in a lock, because the charge the crown truly wanted to make was not witchcraft. Witchcraft as we imagine it, the Sabbath, the pact, the flying, is largely a later construction, a thing that gets assembled over the following 2 centuries. In 1307, the deadliest charge available was apostasy, that these warrior monks sent east to fight Islam had gone over, had lived too long among Saracens, had shared their bread and their libraries and their surrender terms, had learned their sciences and perhaps their prayers, had come home wrong. The idol with the Saracen name is the perfect physical proof of that fear. And it is exactly the sort of proof a royal lawyer invents when he needs one. So there is your mundane answer, and it is a strong one, and you should keep it in your pocket for the rest of these nights. But now let me show you the second solution, the beautiful one, because this is why we are awake. In the 19th century, a scholar and clergyman named Nicholas, and later more famously in the 20th, the writer Idries Shah, and separately the biblical scholar Hugh Schonfield, began to wonder whether the word was not a corruption at all, but a transmission. Shah's suggestion was that behind Baphomet stands an Arabic phrase, Abu Fihamat, or in its more elegant form, Abul Fihamat, the father of understanding. In Sufi usage, palm understanding is not book learning. It is the faculty by which a man perceives the real order of things when the noise of his own self falls quiet. The father of understanding would be the source of that perception, the head from which knowledge descends. And the Templars, remember, spent nearly 200 years in the Levant, They negotiated with the assassins of Masyaf and took tribute from them. They employed Arab physicians. Their grand masters wrote to Muslim princes in courteous Arabic formulae. Some of them, by the end, spoke better Arabic than French. If any Latin Christians in the world were positioned to pick up a Sufi phrase and carry it home in their mouths like a stone from a river, it was these men. Schonfield's idea was different, and, if you like ciphers, more delicious. He noticed that certain Jewish scribal traditions used a simple substitution called the Atbash cipher, in which the first letter of the Hebrew alphabet is exchanged for the last, the second for the second last, and so on. A code known to be in use in the circles that produced the Dead Sea Scrolls and known to medieval Jewish commentators. Schonfield wrote Baphomet in Hebrew letters and applied Atbash to it. What came out, he said, was Sophia, wisdom, the Greek feminine noun for divine wisdom, the Sophia of the Gnostics, the figure who in some older traditions is God's craftsman and companion, the one who was there when the foundations were laid. I must be fair with you, because a guide who is not fair is only an entertainer. Schonfield's cipher has problems. It requires transliterating a French scribe's mangled Occitan into Hebrew in one particular way, and not several other equally possible ways. It is the kind of argument that persuades you completely at 11 at night and looks thinner at 9 in the morning. But I have never been able to make it entirely go away. And here is why. If you are a secret order, and you must give a name to something you may never explain, you do not choose a name at random. And if you are a scribe in 1307, and a broken man mutters a word you have only ever heard used as an insult against Saracens, you will write it as the insult. You will hear what you already know. The record would look precisely the same either way. So, an idol nobody can describe consistently, and a name that means either the Prophet Muhammad, misunderstood, or the Father of Understanding, or Wisdom herself, depending on which door you open. And then there is the inventory. I want to tell you about the inventory, and then I will let you sleep, because it is the one hard object in tonight's chapter, and it deserves to be the last thing. When the king's men seized the Paris temple, they did what officials always do. They made a list. Everything in the treasury, everything in the chapel, item by item, so that nothing could later be said to have gone missing. And in that list, among the chalices and the reliquary arms and the fragments of the true cross that every great church in Europe seemed to own, there is an entry for a reliquary head. It was of silver, gilded. It was the head of a woman. Inside it were bones, wrapped in a shroud of white linen with another cloth of red gauze about them. And there was a label, a little tag sewn or attached, and the label read, Capit 58M, Head 58M. The commissioners questioned a serving brother about it, and he said that he thought it was the head of one of the 11,000 virgins, a reference to the legend of Saint Ursula, whose enormous phantom company of martyred maidens supplied medieval Europe with more relic skulls than any other single source. A perfectly ordinary answer, a perfectly ordinary reliquary. There were hundreds like it, but the label would not lie down. Caput 58 meters. 58. Why number a relic? And what is the M? A measure? Mila, 1,000. and so a bookkeeper's shorthand for the Virgin Martyrs, or as some have proposed with a shiver, the Greek letter that resembles our M, and so a number in another system entirely. Others have read it as the Roman numeral for 58 followed by an abbreviation, and calculated that if you count back 58 years from some particular date, you arrive at some particular event. And every writer who tries this arrives at a different event, which tells you what these calculations are worth. And still others have looked at that entry and said something simpler and stranger, that the order kept a numbered head, wrapped in white and red, the two colors of the temple's own habit and cross, and that when the interrogators started asking about a head, they were not inventing a question. They were asking about something they had seen on a shelf. Hold that. A silver-gilt woman's head with bones inside tagged with a number in a locked treasury in Paris, listed by a royal clerk who had no idea he was writing the most argued over line in the history of the order. The head itself is gone. Of course it is. Nothing survives of it but the sentence in the inventory. Everything the temple owned in France was transferred, sold, melted, dispersed. The great enclosure in Paris was still standing centuries later and was used in the Revolution as a prison for a king and queen. And then it too was pulled down stone by stone on the orders of a nervous emperor. There is a metro station there now. People stand on that ground every morning with coffee in their hands. Tomorrow night we go down the stairs. I mean that literally. Tomorrow we descend into the three great legends of what that head was. The relic in the Jerusalem catacombs that spoke and prophesied. The horned figure of Mendes that a French magician drew in 1856 and gave to the world. And the third story, the strangest, in which Baphomet was never an object at all, but something that stood between two kinds of mind and could be reached briefly by men willing to sit still in the cold for a very long time. I will take each in turn, and I will tell you where the evidence is strong and where it is only a good story wearing the clothes of evidence. For now, though, let me leave you at the top of the steps, where the story properly begins. Picture a chapel in a commandery on a winter night in the late 13th century. Not Paris, somewhere provincial, one of the 9,000 Templar holdings scattered from Portugal to Poland, a farm, a mill, a dovecote, a chapel, a few knights, a few dozen sergeants and shepherds and blacksmiths. Compline has been sung. The lay servants have gone. The door is barred, which the rule permits, because chapter meetings were always held in secret, and that secrecy was written into the statutes for perfectly practical reasons. Discipline, military intelligence, the shaming of brothers before their peers. Nothing sinister. It is simply that the door is shut, and only brothers are inside, and no one else in Christendom knows what is said. At the west end of the chapel there is a stair. Most commanderies had one. The crypt was where the cold went, where the dead of the house lay, where the wine and the strong boxes were kept. The steps are shallow and worn hollow in the middle from boots. The air changes about 4 steps down. You feel it on the back of your hands first, a wetness in the cold that was not there above. There is a sound of water, not running, dropping. Single drops from the vault onto stone at long, uneven intervals, so that you find yourself waiting for the next one, and it does not come when you expect it. Now we descend. Not into the physical stone, though we will do that too before these 5 nights are through, but first into the depths of what men claimed to have seen, what they swore they had witnessed, and what scholars have spent 700 years trying to decide was real or invented, or something far stranger, something true in a way that reality, by itself, does not quite accommodate. The question is, what was Baphomet? And the answer, and this is where I ask you to hold 2 contradictory thoughts at once, the way a medieval mind could hold them, is that it was 3 things. Or perhaps it was 1 thing wearing 3 faces, or perhaps it was no thing at all, but a word that opened a door in people's minds, and what came through was different for each man who opened it. The archive will not settle it for us. The archive never settles anything. It only accumulates evidence. And evidence, as you may have noticed in your own life, is not the same thing as truth. Let us start with the most concrete claim. In the autumn of 1307, the night that the raids happened, one of the arrested Templars, a man whose name the records give as Jean Taillefer, a sergeant, not a knight, which matters because sergeants were the practical men, the men who did things, was brought before the royal inquisitors in Paris with a very specific question. They asked him about a head. They asked him if he had ever seen a head. They asked him if this head had been kept in a reliquary, and if it had been kept in Paris, and if it had been brought out at certain times, and if brothers had knelt before it. And Jean Taillefer, after the preliminary courtesies of starvation and irons, said yes. He said yes to all of it. And then he said something that gives us our first real legend. He said that the head was the head of John the Baptist. Now, John the Baptist is a figure who sits at a peculiar juncture in Christian history. He baptized Jesus Christ himself, which made him in some sense the gateway between the old law and the new. He was beheaded by Herod at the request of Salome, the daughter of Herodias, the woman Herod had married unlawfully, and Salome, in some versions of the story, demanded his head on a platter as a reward for dancing. The head then became a relic, and relics in the medieval world were not quaint. They were power. They were proximity to the divine. They were proof that the holy had touched the earth. By the 13th century, Europe was drowning in the heads of John the Baptist. There was one in Rome, one in Amiens, one in Constantinople, one in a dozen other cathedrals and monasteries, each one certified and catalogued and displayed on feast days. The multiplication of John's head across Christendom is one of those facts that historians mention quietly, in footnotes, as if embarrassed by the medieval mind's capacity for contradiction. How could the same man have so many heads? The answer, of course, is that he couldn't, and nobody seriously believed he could, and everybody acted as if he could, and nobody spoke about it. It was a cooperative fiction. It was medieval Europe's way of saying, we know this is impossible, but the symbolic weight of this impossible thing is so useful that we will all agree to pretend. The Templars, according to Jean Taillefer, had found another one. Their version was different from the others. Their version, he said, was the real one. It had been discovered in the catacombs beneath the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, the underground passages that wind beneath the Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque, where the Templars had their headquarters for nearly 200 years. And in those catacombs, according to this theory, there was a chamber that predated Islam, that went back perhaps to the Temple of Solomon himself, or to the times before the Romans came. And in that chamber, wrapped in black cloth and surrounded by a circle of gold dust, was the actual head of John, preserved by some method that nobody quite understood. Mummified, perhaps, or preserved by the mineral deposits in the stone itself. The way some bodies in certain caves emerge from the earth unchanged after 1,000 years. Here is where the story becomes stranger. According to Taillefer and the handful of other knights who volunteered similar accounts, and I want you to notice that these men, when given the chance to lie, often chose to tell stories that made them sound like they had participated in grave robbing and idol worship, which was not the wisest choice. The head was not merely kept, it was used, it spoke, or it was believed to speak, or men who meditated in its presence heard voices. The accounts vary, and again, the variance itself is instructive. Some said the head had eyes of lapis lazuli or emerald, and when candlelight caught them, they seemed to move. Some said it had a beard of actual hair, preserved somehow, streaked with gray. Some said it was impossibly small, more like a skull than a natural human head. Some said that when brothers brought it out during secret chapter meetings, the temperature in the room would drop, and candles would flicker without wind, and a sound like wind through a cavern would be heard, though all the doors were shut. Some said it was consulted like an oracle. Men would approach it and ask it questions about the future, about the health of the order, about coming wars, about the location of treasure, and they would fall into a trance. And when they woke, they would speak words that had to be interpreted by the older brothers, men who claimed to understand its language. One account, given by a knight named Guy de Auvergne and recorded in the Dominican Register of 1310, describes a head with what appears to be two faces. Or possibly he was describing the effect of candlelight on a sculpted face. The way a face carved in shadow seems to shift and become multiple when you move the light. Or possibly he was under torture. The context in the documents does not specify. What is certain is that a man under interrogation saw fit to describe a head that did not look the way human heads look, and this description seemed, to the men interrogating him, to be evidence of something demonic. Now let us pause here, because we are reaching a moment where we need to do something difficult. We need to ask whether any of this was true, and we need to hold three positions at once. The first position is the skeptical one. It says these men were tortured, they were starved, they were kept in dark cells. They were asked leading questions by men whose entire career depended on finding heresy. Under such circumstances, a man will say anything. He will confess to flying through the air if you ask him in the right way. He will describe a head with two faces if the interrogator has already suggested it. This is not a judgment on John Taillefer or any of the other accused men. It is simply how the human mind works under extreme duress. We know this because we have studied confession under torture extensively in the modern era, and we have learned that torture is an excellent way to produce confessions and a terrible way to produce truth. By this account, Baphomet was a legal fiction. It was the Inquisitors' invention, suggested through their questions, and the knights merely echoed back what they were asked. The head was real. We have the inventory to prove that, but it was not John the Baptist, and it did not speak, and it was probably not particularly sacred. It was perhaps a memento, or a mistake, or a relic that had lost its label and been given a new story in the chaos of the early 14th century. The second position is the literal one. It says, "Some of the men who confessed were not under torture. Some of them, when brought before the Pope's own commissioners years later, freely and without duress repeated parts of the story. They had nothing to gain by persisting. The Pope's commissioners were not trying to prove the Templars guilty. If anything, they were investigating the royal abuse of power, the arbitrary seizure of property, the violation of ecclesiastical immunity. A man speaking before such judges had every incentive to recant if he had lied, to say, 'I was tortured, I said whatever they wanted to hear.' But instead, some men repeated what they had seen. They described ceremonies. They described devotion. They described something in the chamber beneath the temple that they could not explain, but that they had experienced. They testified that they had not been alone in witnessing it. They named other witnesses. By this account, the head was real, and its properties were real, and the Templars really did possess something that frightened the Church. The Church destroyed them, not because they were heretics, but because they knew something." And then there is the third position. It is the one that appears in the oldest sources, the one that was being discussed by Islamic scholars in the Levant, and by Jewish Kabbalists in Spain, and by Christian mystics in France, all at the same time, all in the 13th century before the trials. It is the position that what the Templars possessed was not an object at all, but a technology, not in the modern sense, not a machine, but a method, a way of seeing, a way of opening perception to something that was there all along but invisible, a way of contacting, briefly, the dead or the divine, or some faculty of consciousness that lived between those two realms. And if this was true, then the head that appeared in the catacombs was not the preservation of John the Baptist's skull. That would be impossible, but a focal point, a thing to look at while you did the real work in your mind. This third position might sound mystical, even superstitious, but I will ask you to hold it for a moment, because it explains something that the other two positions struggle with. It explains why, if the Templars were simply in possession of a fraudulent relic, like dozens of other European institutions, the Church moved so decisively and so quickly against them. It explains why the Crown needed to move at dawn in coordinated raids across the entire kingdom, rather than bringing charges and trying them in the normal way. It explains why the interrogations, once they began, focused so obsessively on the head, on the ceremonies, on the exact nature of what was being worshipped, and it especially explains what happened after. Because what happened after is the strangest part. 500 years later, in the middle of the 19th century, a man named Eliphas Lévy, a French occultist, ceremonial magician, and something between a charlatan and a genuine seeker, depending on whom you ask, sat down with the old trial records and began to think about what the Templars might actually have been doing in those ceremonial chambers. Lévy was not a historian in the modern sense. He was interested in the esoteric tradition, the secret knowledge that was supposed to run under the surface of Western civilization like an underground river. And as he read the accounts of Baphomet, as he absorbed the descriptions of a being that was neither wholly male nor wholly female, neither wholly human nor wholly animal, neither wholly material nor wholly spiritual, he had an idea. What if Baphomet was not a relic at all, but a symbol? What if the Templars had created a figure, a sculpture, a drawing, an image that existed in the ritual space, that represented the perfect synthesis of all opposites, the marriage of matter and spirit, the union of the masculine and the feminine, the wisdom of the old pagan world and the revelation of the new Christian one? And so Lévy drew it. He created a famous engraving, one that would eventually appear in his book Dogmes et Rituels de la Haute Magie, published in 1856. It is called the Goat of Mendes, or sometimes Baphomet, or the Sabbatic Goat. And it is extraordinary. The figure in the engraving is hermaphroditic, a human torso, masculine and muscular, but with prominent breasts. The face and head are that of a goat, with long curved horns, and the goat's face is itself divided, looking both forward and inward at the same time. In one upraised hand it holds a torch, or a flaming torch of knowledge, the fire bright and clear. In the other hand, which is lowered, it holds a caduceus, the twin serpents entwined around a staff, the symbol of Hermes, the god of boundaries and transitions. The figure has wings like a bat, or like the wings of a demon in medieval art, but rendered in a way that suggests not evil, but transcendence, the ability to exist in multiple realms at once. And at the base of the figure, beneath the hooves, are symbols. The moon below the right foot, the sun below the left, representing the union of lunar and solar consciousness, the feminine and masculine principles, night and day, intuition and reason. It is beautiful and disturbing at the same time. It is impossible and perfect. It is the kind of image that once you have seen it, you cannot unsee. And the question that haunts everyone who has ever studied this period is, did Lévy invent it, or did he recover it? Because here is the thing that nobody can quite explain away. The descriptions that come out of the torture chambers in 1307, the broken fragments of testimony from men who were being systematically destroyed, contain certain elements that do not appear in any other source. And yet those same elements appear in Lévy's drawing 550 years later in a form of such crystalline precision that it is almost impossible to believe it came from his own imagination. The hermaphroditism, the goat head, the division between knowledge, the torch, and power, the caduceus, the wings, the perfect synthesis of opposites, all of it there. Did the Templars possess this image? Was it drawn in hidden rooms in the Paris Temple, or in the commanderies scattered across France and England and the Holy Land? Or did some knowledge of it survive in whispered traditions, in those underground rivers of secret knowledge that the occultists believed in? Or did Lévy, working only from the trial records and his own intuition, simply recover something that the human imagination, when it reaches a certain level of consciousness, naturally arrives at? The historical answer is that we do not know. And that answer, which might seem like a failure of history, is actually the most honest thing we can say. But let me tell you about the third version, because it is the one that haunts me most deeply. And it is the one that connects everything that came before to everything that comes after in this story. In the esoteric traditions, the real ones, not the Victorian fantasies, but the genuine mystical lineages that ran through Islam and Judaism and the Christian West, there was a concept that had no single name but many names in many languages. In Arabic, it was sometimes called Al-Quwa Al-Ola, the primary force. In Hebrew, it was Gevurah, the force of judgment and strength. In Greek, it was the demiurge, the shaper. In Latin Christianity, it was sometimes understood as the Holy Spirit, sometimes as Lucifer before his fall, sometimes as neither and both at once. It was the force that stood between the human consciousness and the divine consciousness, the intermediary, the translator, the threshold keeper. And the tradition held that this force could be contacted directly, that it was not demonic, but mediating, not evil, but necessary, not a rebellion against God, but the manifestation of one aspect of God's own nature. The Templars, according to some of the older mystical texts, had discovered a way to contact this force, not through prayer in the conventional Christian sense, not through the sacraments, though they performed those dutifully, but through a specific practice, a method that involved ritual and fasting, and sometimes the use of herbs and prepared substances, and always a sustained concentration of will. And the reports that come out of the interrogations hint at this. When a man describes falling into a trance before the head, when another describes hearing voices, when a third speaks of visions of other worlds, these are not the fantasies of a tortured mind. They are the reports of experiences that have been documented across cultures and centuries by men and women who engaged in these particular practices. They are the reports of people making contact with something. What was that something? Here we must be very careful. Here we must distinguish between what was real and what was imagined, and that distinction is not, I think, as clear as modern rationality likes to pretend. The head itself was probably not sentient. It probably did not speak in words that anyone could hear with their ears. But a mind in a certain state of consciousness, looking at a compelling image, a head carved with skill and strangeness, placed in candlelight in a chamber beneath the earth, in silence and solitude, can experience phenomena that are, to that consciousness, absolutely real. The head does speak, the eyes do move, the temperature does drop, the whole world becomes thin, permeable, alive with presence. And whether this experience originates in the external world or in the architecture of human consciousness itself is a question that I suspect is not the right question to ask. Because the experience is real. It changes people. It gives them knowledge they did not have before. It connects them to something larger than themselves. The Templars may have understood this better than we do. They may have known that the greatest power is not to mistake the symbolic for the literal, but to understand that the symbolic is a form of truth, perhaps a deeper form than the merely material. The head of John the Baptist, whether or not it was literally the head of John the Baptist, was a gateway. It was a tool. It was a way of focusing consciousness towards something that existed in a realm that medieval Latin Christendom did not have very good language for, but that every human culture at some depth has names for. Lévy's drawing, then, is not so much an invention as a recovery. He looked at the fragments and felt his way back to the whole. He understood that Baphomet was not a demon to be feared, but a principle to be understood. He recognized it as the figure that stands at the threshold, the keeper of the boundary between seen and unseen, matter and spirit, time and eternity. And in drawing it, in rendering it in such detail and clarity, He made it visible to the world in a way that it had not been visible since the Templars themselves had understood and worked with these principles. But there is something else, something that takes us from the realm of history into the realm of direct experience, and I must tell you about it because it is the bridge to tomorrow night. In the early 20th century, a scholar named Louis Charpentier, working from the trial records and from the architecture of the Templar commanderies, began to notice something peculiar. The buildings themselves seemed to have been designed with certain proportions, certain orientations, certain symbolic elements that were not accidental. The layout of the chambers, the placement of doorways, the height of ceilings, the direction they faced, all of it seemed to be encoded with information. And when Charpentier began to reconstruct what a ritual space would have looked like, what a sequence of movements through these chambers might accomplish, he realized that the Templars were not simply worshipping, they were performing something. They were conducting a technology of consciousness. The practice seems to have worked something like this. A brother would be led down into the crypt, down the worn stone stairs, into cold and darkness, and the sound of dripping water. His senses would be systematically disoriented. The path would turn in ways that confused his sense of direction. Sometimes he would be kept waiting in darkness. Sometimes he would be brought suddenly into candlelight. The air would be thick with incense, myrrh, frankincense, and other herbs that in certain quantities can induce altered states of consciousness. Then he would be brought into the presence of the head. He would be required to meditate, to empty his mind, to wait. And in that waiting, something would happen. The boundary between himself and the image would thin. The image would begin to seem alive. And if he was ready for this experience, if his consciousness was prepared by fasting and prayer and the removal of ordinary distractions, then he would cross a threshold. On the other side of that threshold, according to the reports, was knowledge. Not knowledge in the sense of facts or information, but knowledge in the sense of direct perception. A temporary widening of consciousness in which he could perceive things that ordinarily lay outside the range of human awareness. He would see, or seem to see, other worlds. He would understand, for a moment, the structure of reality in a way that made his ordinary understanding seem childish and limited. And if the older brothers were skilled in the interpretation of these visions, they could use them. They could ask questions of themselves, of the image, of the consciousness that stood between themselves and the absolute divine, and answers would come. This was not heresy in the sense that it rejected Christian faith. Many of the Templars seem to have understood it as a deepening of Christian faith, a way of moving beyond the literal understanding of doctrine into a direct experience of the holy. But it was absolutely heresy in the sense that it claimed direct access to the divine without the mediation of the church, without priests, without sacraments, without the institutional structure of Orthodox Christianity. And to the Church of Rome in 1307, that was far more dangerous than any worship of demons could have been. Because what the church feared most was not that the Templars worshipped Satan. It was that they worshipped nothing but the unmediated presence of God. And they had found a way to do it that required no intermediaries, no institutional permission, no papal authority. The head, whatever it was a tool for a revolution of consciousness. and revolutions of consciousness are the most dangerous kind. So tomorrow we will go deeper still. Tomorrow we will learn what the actual practices were, what the Templars actually did in those hidden chambers, and why some of them persisted in their accounts, even when they had every incentive to recant. And we will begin to see how a history that was supposed to be closed, supposed to be finished, began to leak through the cracks and persist in places where it had no business being. For now, though, I want to leave you with this image. A figure standing in a candlelit chamber beneath the earth. Around him, brothers in white mantles. In front of him, an object, a head, a sculpture, an image, a focal point. And he is looking at this thing, and the moment stretches out, and something in him shifts. His consciousness, which has been confined his whole life to a narrow channel, suddenly widens. The walls of the chamber seem to fall away. For a moment, and it never lasts longer than a moment, and yet in that moment 1,000 years seem to pass. He perceives something absolute. He sees the structure beneath the structure. He understands the language of creation itself. And then it is over. The moment passes. He is back in his body, cold, shaking, tears on his face. He does not know if what he saw was real or imagined. He does not know if it was God or something else, or something that those words cannot describe. But he knows it was true. He knows it changed him, and he knows he would spend the rest of his life trying to understand it, trying to find his way back to that threshold, trying to live in the light of what he saw there. This is why they did not recant, not all of them, and not all the time, but some of them, when given the choice between a comfortable lie and the truth of their own experience, chose the truth. And they went to the fire knowing that the men burning them did not understand what they had found, did not understand what they were destroying, did not understand that they were putting to death something that had touched the divine. You remember it. The shallow steps worn hollow in the middle by 200 years of boots. The change in the air 4 steps down, felt first on the backs of the hands. The water falling drop by drop, at intervals just uneven enough that you cannot learn the rhythm. And at the bottom, a man with a lamp, waiting, who asks you a question in a language you half recognize. Tonight we go down, but before we do, I must give you something to hold on to, because tonight is the night when the story is most likely to run away with us, and I do not want you carried off. So here is the handrail, and I want you to keep your hand on it the whole way down. The handrail is this. We possess the rule of the Templars. We actually have it. It is not lost. It is not rumored. It is not hidden in a Vatican basement behind a locked grille. It survives in multiple manuscripts in French and Latin. It has been printed and translated and footnoted for 150 years. And any one of us could read the whole thing in an afternoon. It began in 1129 at the Council of Troy as a short document of some 72 clauses, drafted with the involvement of Bernard of Clairvaux, the most influential churchman in Europe. Over the following century and a half it grew, the way all institutional documents grow, by accretion, statutes on hierarchy, statutes on conventual life, statutes on the holding of chapters, statutes on penances, until by the 13th century it ran to some 686 clauses. It is one of the most complete pictures of the interior life of any medieval institution we possess. And here is the astonishing thing, the thing that ought to be the beginning of every discussion of Templar secrecy and almost never is. There is nothing in it. No idol, no head, no invocation, no goat, no serpent, no torch, no threshold. What there is instead is bread and horses and beds. It tells you that a brother shall have 3 horses and 1 squire. It tells you what he eats, meat 3 days a week, because more would soften him, and on the other days a portion of vegetables or fish. And 2 brothers must eat from the same dish, so that neither takes more than his share. And if one refuses his portion, the other may report him. It tells you that he sleeps in a shirt and breeches, in a lit dormitory, never in darkness, and never alone. It tells you that he may not hunt with falcons, may not read letters from his own family without permission, may not speak at table, may not kiss any woman, mother, sister, aunt, none. It regulates the length of his beard, the plainness of his bridle, the absence of gold on his stirrups. It tells you that when he dies, 100 paternosters shall be said for his soul, and that his portion of food shall be given to a poor man for 40 days. It is, from beginning to end, the most detailed portrait of ordinary, granular, exhausting, unglamorous monastic discipline you could ask for, written by men whose deepest concern was that their soldiers not become vain. Hold that. Every night this week, whenever the story lifts off the ground and begins to fly, come back and put your hand on the bread and the horses and the 2 brothers eating from 1 dish. Now, having said that, I must tell you the second thing, which is that the rule also contains a hole, and the hole is precisely the right shape and precisely the right size for everything that follows. The hole is the chapter. Every commandery of the temple held chapter, a weekly assembly of the brothers of that house, usually on a Sunday, held in the chapel or the chapter house. And the rule, in its later statutes, surrounds this assembly with an extraordinary apparatus of secrecy. Before chapter begins, the doors are shut. No man who is not a professed brother of the order may be present, not a servant, not a guest, not a bishop, not a priest of the parish. Sentries were posted at the doors of some houses, and the brothers were told, in terms, that what was said in chapter did not leave chapter. The penalty for revealing the proceedings of a chapter was among the gravest the order had: expulsion, the loss of the habit, the loss of everything a man had given his life to. Why? What was so terrible? The mundane answer, and I will give you the mundane answer first, always, is that chapter was where discipline happened. Chapter was where a brother stood in the middle of the room and accused himself of his faults before all his fellows, or where another accused him. It was where you learned that Brother Guillaume had struck a Christian, that Brother Odo had lost his horse through carelessness, that Brother Pierre had been found with a woman, that Brother Raymond had spoken with a Saracen without leave. It was where penances were assigned, eating on the floor with the dogs for a year and a day, being flogged in the chapel in front of the assembly by the chaplain. It was where men were stripped of the habit. It was, in short, where the most senior and feared soldiers in Christendom were seen weeping, confessing, lying, being beaten, and being humiliated. And it was where military intelligence was discussed. Which castles were undermanned, what the order's debts were, what a sultan had offered, what a king had refused. If you were the Grand Master, you would seal that room too. There is nothing occult about it. The secrecy of the chapter is the secrecy of a court-martial and a confessional and a war council held in one room. But, and here is where I must be honest with you in a way that pleases neither the debunkers nor the mystics, the secrecy was real. It was total. It was enforced by the most severe penalties in the Order's disciplinary code, and it lasted for 180 years across 9,000 properties. And so, when the king's men came in October 1307, they were opening a room that no outsider in Europe had ever seen the inside of. They did not know what happened in there. Neither did the Pope. Neither did the bishops. Neither, quite possibly, did most of the brothers of a neighboring house, because chapters were local, and what was said in one was not said in another. Now imagine you are a royal lawyer, and you must destroy an order of the church, and you have in front of you a sealed room that has been sealed for 6 generations. You do not need to know what is inside it. Its being sealed is the accusation. Every man in Europe will fill that room himself out of his own imagination, and no imagination in 1307 was innocent. And imagine, from the other side, that you are a brother of the temple, 40 years old, illiterate, a shepherd's son from Rouergue, who was received into the order at 19 and has served in Cyprus and lost 2 fingers. And you are sitting in the dark in the Châtelet after 4 days without food, and a Dominican in a clean habit is asking you, with great patience, what happened in the room. And every time you tell him what actually happened, the confessions, the floggings, the paternosters, he writes nothing down and asks you again. You begin to understand what he wants. That understanding is the most dangerous thing in this entire story. So what did they actually do? Let us take the one moment that every single arrested Templar had experienced, without exception, because it was the moment that made him a Templar. The reception. We know a great deal about it, and this is not disputed. The reception ceremony is described in the rule, and it is described consistently in hundreds of depositions by men who had no motive to lie about it, and the 2 accounts match. It happened at night or in the very early morning. It happened in chapter, behind the shut door. The candidate waited in an adjoining room while the assembled brothers were asked 3 times whether any man knew a reason he should not be admitted. Then he was brought in and made to kneel, and he asked, this is the formula, and it survives in the Old French, for the bread and water of the house, and the company of the brothers, and the poor clothing of the order. And the presiding officer told him, with real bluntness, what he was asking for. You see us in fine mantles and on good horses, he said, but you do not see the hardship. When you wish to be in France, you will be sent to Cyprus. When you wish to sleep, you will be made to wake. When you wish to eat, you will be made to ride. Can you bear it? Then came the questions, and they were legal questions, dull and vital. Are you freeborn? Are you a bastard? Are you in debt? Are you married? Are you betrothed? Are you already professed in another order? Have you bribed anyone to be here? Are you excommunicate? Are you in sound body? Because a man received under a false answer to any of these could void his own profession and embarrass the order in the courts. Then the vows: obedience, chastity, poverty, and the 4th, to help conquer and defend the Holy Land. Then the mantle was placed on his shoulders and fastened at the neck by the presiding officer, and the chaplain said a psalm and the prayer of the Holy Spirit. And every brother present said a paternoster. Then the officer raised him up and kissed him on the mouth, the standard kiss of peace of a feudal and monastic society given between men constantly and meaning nothing more sinister than a handshake. And the chaplain kissed him also. Then he was seated, and the rules of the house were read to him, where he might go, what he might say, when he might speak, that he must never leave the house without permission, that he must never strike a Christian, and 100 other things he would not remember. That is the reception. That is what happened. Thousands of men experienced it in a dozen kingdoms over 2 centuries, and no part of it is heretical, and no part of it is secret except by the general seal of the chapter. And onto this ordinary, tedious, deeply human ceremony of a young man asking for bread and being warned about Cyprus, the interrogation of 1307 grafted 3 additional things. And the 3 additional things are the whole of our story. The first was the denial. The accusation was that after the mantle was placed on him, the candidate was taken aside, often behind the altar in a corner, in a sacristy, out of the hearing of the main assembly, and shown a crucifix and told that he must deny the Christ upon it 3 times and spit upon it, or beside it, or on the ground before it. The second was the kiss, not the kiss of peace on the mouth, which was public and universal, but additional kisses in additional places, the navel, the base of the spine, sometimes the buttocks. The third was the license, that the receptor told him the brothers might relieve their lust with one another, and this was no sin. And if he were asked by another brother, he must not refuse. Now I want to walk very carefully here, because this is the center of the labyrinth. Of the men questioned in Paris in October and November 1307, the overwhelming majority admitted to the first charge in some form. That is the horrifying statistic. But look at the shape of the admissions, and it begins to come apart in your hands. Almost every man who admitted the denial added something to it, unprompted, and the additions are all the same addition. He said, "I denied with the mouth and not with the heart." He said, "I was ordered to, and I feared, and so I said the words, but I did not mean them." He said, "I spat beside the cross and not upon it." He said, "I deny, but I did not say the name." He said, "I did it once, quickly, and I confessed it to a priest afterwards and did penance for it 20 years ago, and I have thought about it every day since." That is not the testimony of a heretic. A heretic, a real one, a Cathar perfectus, of whom the Inquisition had interrogated thousands and knew the type intimately, argues. A real heretic has a theology and will die for it. And the registers of Languedoc are full of men and women who calmly told the inquisitors that the Church of Rome was the church of wolves, and that the material world was made by the devil, and who went to the fire without recanting a syllable. Not one Templar, in 7 years of proceedings across Europe, articulated a heretical doctrine. Not one defended the denial as true. Not one said, "Yes, and here is why we do it, and here is what we believe instead." Every single one who admitted it framed it as a shameful thing he had done under pressure and regretted, which is either the sign of a very shallow heresy indeed, or the sign of something else entirely. And here is the something else, and it is the most interesting reading available to us. and I want to give it to you properly. Suppose the ceremony was real. Suppose that in at least some houses, in at least some decades, a young knight newly mantled was taken aside and shown the cross and told to deny it. What could that possibly be for? There are two serious answers, and neither is devil worship. The first is the soldier's answer. These were men being sent to the Levant, where capture was not a risk, but a near certainty over a long career, and where a captured Christian was routinely offered a choice: apostasy or death, the Shahada or the sword. The order's own history is full of it. After the Horns of Hattin in 1187, Saladin had the captured Templars and Hospitallers executed to a man, and the chroniclers record that some were offered conversion first. What if, somewhere in the 12th or 13th century, in some house, some officer conceived of a rehearsal, a hardening? You will one day be told to deny him with a blade at your throat. Here tonight, among brothers, in safety, do it once with your mouth, so that you learn in your bones the difference between the mouth and the heart. Then when the day comes, and you say the words to save the lives of the men behind you, you will know that you have not fallen because you did this once already, and you were shriven, and you were still a brother in the morning. I want to be very clear. There is no document that says this. It is a reconstruction, but it explains the phrase that appears in deposition after deposition, in the mouths of men who never met each other, in 4 languages, ore non cord, with the mouth and not the heart, better than any other explanation I know. That phrase had to come from somewhere. Either the inquisitors fed it to every witness, which the surviving question lists do not support, or the men had heard it before, in the room, on the night, from the officer who told them to speak. The second serious answer is the mystical one, and it is the one that leads us down the stair. In the Christian mystical tradition, there is a current, old, respectable, and utterly terrifying, that holds that the final obstacle between the soul and God is the soul's own image of God. The greatest theologians of the age were saying it out loud. The pseudo-Dionysian writings, which every educated churchman knew, taught that God is best approached by negation. Not this, not that, not light, not darkness, not being. Meister Eckhart, preaching in Germany within a generation of the trials, said that a man must pray to God to be free of God. This is orthodox, barely contentiously, but orthodox. And it means something quite specific. It means that the picture in your head is not the thing. It means that the painted panel, the carved figure, the crucifix you kiss, is a step, and steps must be stepped off. Now put that idea in the hands of men who are not theologians. Put it in the hands of a warrior aristocracy, largely illiterate, who have spent generations in the Eastern Mediterranean among Sufis, who speak of annihilation of the self, among Jewish contemplatives in Spain and Provence, who speak of the divine as Ein Sof, the no end that cannot be pictured, among Byzantine monks who sit in silence in Athos repeating one name until the mind falls quiet. Put it in the hands of men who cannot read Dionysius, but who have heard it summarized by a chaplain who could. What do you get? You get a ritual. You get a physical act that stands in for a metaphysical one. You get deny the image so that you may hold the reality. Spit upon the wood because the wood is not him, and the day you confuse them, You have made an idol of your own salvation. You get an initiation in the truest sense of the word, a deliberate, controlled shattering of the candidate's most cherished certainty, performed on the very night he has committed his life, at the moment of maximum psychological vulnerability, in front of the only men whose opinion will ever matter to him again. And notice what such a rite would produce in the men who underwent it. It would produce exactly the depositions we have. It would produce a man who tells the Inquisitor, "Yes, I did it, and it was terrible, and I did not understand it, and I confessed it afterwards, and I never spoke of it again." Because if the point of the rite was to break the image, then the men who could not grasp the point, most of them, the shepherd's sons, the sergeants, the boys of 19, would carry it for the rest of their lives as a wound and a scandal, a night they did not understand and could not explain. Which is precisely what they said over and over for 7 years, in every kingdom in Europe. Do you see how the same set of facts becomes 3 entirely different stories depending on where you stand? A fabrication by lawyers, a soldier's inoculation against apostasy under torture, or a genuine mystical initiation whose meaning was known to a handful and misunderstood by thousands. The documents support all 3. I lean, if you want my honest weight, toward a mixture, a rite that existed in some houses that meant one of those 2 things to the officers who administered it, and that meant nothing but shame and confusion to the men who received it, and that a royal lawyer with a list of 127 articles then inflated into a demonic liturgy. Which brings us to the pyramid, because there is a question underneath all of this that the trial records force upon us and cannot answer, and it is, who knew? If there was an inner practice, how many men were inside it? 3 possibilities have been argued for 700 years. The first is the narrow pyramid. Only the summit knew. The Grand Master, the Visitor of France, the great preceptors, perhaps 3 or 4 men in a large commandery, and none at all in a small one. Under this reading, the order was a body of some 15,000 men, of whom perhaps a few dozen possessed anything worth calling a secret, and the rest were farmers and cavalrymen who had joined a religious corporation for the same reasons men have always joined such things: family, land, security, the forgiveness of sins, the hope of heaven, and the fact that an uncle had done it. The evidence for this reading is strong and mostly consists of the depositions themselves. The confessions are wildly inconsistent about the idol precisely because almost nobody had seen it, and men who have not seen a thing but are being beaten until they describe it will describe a cat, a beard, 4 feet, 2 faces, 3 faces, gold, wood, paint. The inconsistency is the fingerprint of ignorance, and it fits the sociology. No organization of 15,000 men has ever kept a genuine secret among all 15,000. Not one in the whole history of the world. The second is the broad oath. Everyone was inside it. Every professed brother experienced the aside behind the altar, the words, the spitting. But each experienced it once at 19 in a dark room, in a state of terror, and then never again for the rest of his life, and never spoke of it, not to his closest companion of 30 years, because the oath of the chapter forbade it. Under this reading, the inconsistencies are not the fingerprint of ignorance, but the fingerprint of memory. 15,000 men trying to recall one confusing night from decades earlier, under torture, with a leading question in front of them. Anyone who has ever compared two honest witnesses to the same event will recognize it. This reading has one great piece of evidence behind it, and it is the geography. The confessions came from Paris and Normandy, and the Auvergne and Languedoc and the Rhône, from men who had served in Cyprus and men who had never left the Loire, from knights and from sergeants and from serving brothers who cared for pigs. Whatever it was not confined to one house or one province. The third possibility is the one I find hardest to dismiss and hardest to prove, and it is that the order was a pyramid of meanings rather than of secrets, that the same rite was performed everywhere, in the open, in front of everyone, and that what it meant was disclosed in stages, or not at all, or only to those who asked the right question afterwards. There is nothing exotic about this. It is how every serious tradition of instruction on earth has always worked, from the guilds to the universities to the Sufi orders the Templars lived beside for 2 centuries. The apprentice is shown the gesture. Years later, if he is still there and still asking, he is told what the gesture is. Most never ask. Most do the gesture their whole lives and die not knowing, and are no worse off. Under this reading, there was no hidden inner circle plotting in a vault. There was an outer form known to all, and an inner reading known to few, and the trials caught 15,000 men who all knew the form, and could not, between them, produce the reading, because the dozen men who had it were either dead or in the Châtelet with their feet burned off, or had decided that some things are not said to a Dominican with a list. And now, let us finally go down. Here is what a night in the crypt would have involved, and I am going to tell you which parts are documented, which are reconstructed, and which are frankly legend, because you deserve to know which is which, even at this hour. Documented. The hour. The order rose in the dark. Matins was sung at or before dawn, and the brothers were required to be present unless riding. Documented. The fasting. The rule prescribes fasts of great severity, Fridays, Advent, Lent, vigils of feasts, and the physiological effect of prolonged fasting on human consciousness is not a matter of legend, but of medicine. It lowers the threshold of suggestion, sharpens some perceptions, dissolves others, and in extended form produces the experiences that every ascetic tradition on earth has independently catalogued. Documented. The incense. Frankincense and myrrh were burned in every Latin church in Europe. The Templars had chapels and chaplains and thuribles like everyone else, and myrrh smoke in an unventilated stone room is not a neutral substance. Documented. The silence. Speech was restricted. The rule enjoins that brothers keep silence at meals and after compline, and that they not chatter in chapel. Documented. The darkness, the cold, and the crypt itself, which existed under a great many commandery chapels, because that is where you put the dead and the wine. Reconstructed. The sequence. Take those documented elements, waking in the dark, fasting, silence, incense, cold, an underground chamber, a single light, and understand that you are looking at an inventory of every technique that human beings have ever used on every continent to alter the state of their own consciousness. Not one of these things is magic. All of them together apply to a 19-year-old boy who has not eaten since yesterday, who has been awake since 2 in the morning, who has been silent for 6 hours, who has just given away his freedom, his family, his body, and his future, and who is now led down a turning stair into a cold room where one candle burns in front of an object he has never seen. That is not magic either. That is engineering. And whether or not the men who built it knew what they were building, it works. It has always worked. It works on you and me. Legend. The rest. And now, having built the handrail, let me show you what the legend says, because it is beautiful and because you have earned it. The legend says that in the deepest houses, not all, only a few, and always the old ones, the ones founded before 1150, the brothers kept a vigil that appears in no statute. The letters that survive from the 14th century, from bishops and royal officers picking through the wreckage of the order, contain a phrase that has never been satisfactorily explained. Complaints of night prayers that do not correspond to the hours of the church, not matins, not vigils. Something else at some other hour, said by some of the brothers and not others. The legend says that at that hour the object was brought out, that the brothers sat, not knelt, which in itself would have been a scandal, in a circle in the dark, and that one of them held the light, that there were no words for the first part of it, only breathing and waiting, and the sound of water. That the older brothers had a phrase they used to teach the younger what to do with the mind in that silence, and the phrase, if you believe the esoteric transmission, was about becoming an empty vessel, that the head before them was empty of everything except what filled it, and that the brother's own head must be made the same, and that this is what wisdom is, not the accumulation of knowledge, but the hollowing out that permits it to arrive. The legend says that when a man was ready, and only then, he was permitted to ask a question, and that the answers came in a form that had to be interpreted in images and not sentences, and that the interpretation was the work of the older men, and that this is why the practice could not be written down, because a written answer is a dead answer, and only a living brother can read a vision. And the legend says, and here is where I put both hands up and tell you plainly that we have left the archive behind, that among the visions there was one that recurred across houses and generations, and that it was always the same, and that the older brothers came to dread it. It was a vision of the end of the order, of a morning in autumn, of doors opening without a knock, of white mantles in the street in the cold, and no one drawing a sword. You will want to know whether I believe that. Let me answer you honestly, because it is nearly time to sleep. I believe that men who sit in the dark in a cold room after fasting, in silence, with one light, will see things. That is not belief. That is documented across every culture that has ever tried it. I believe that some of what they see is trivial, and some of it is astonishing, and that the astonishing part is astonishing whether or not it comes from outside. I believe that an institution built for war in the Levant, which by 1300 had lost the Levant, whose reason for existing had been burnt out of it at Acre in 1291, whose leaders were negotiating with kings who owed them money. I believe that such an institution did not need an oracle to feel the ground moving. Every intelligent man in the order knew what had happened to the order. A brother sitting in the dark, having emptied his mind, would be an unusual man indeed if the thing that rose up to fill it were not the fear that every one of them carried by daylight and none of them said aloud. And that, I think, is the truest sense in which the head spoke. Not a jaw moving, not a voice in the ears. A room built for hearing, and 15,000 men who had something they could not say, and a night once a week when the door was shut and the light was low and the ordinary furniture of the mind was set aside. And in that space, what they already knew came up through the floor and looked at them. Tomorrow, the fire. Tomorrow we walk through the 7 years between the arrests and the end, the confessions and the retractions, the Council of Vienne, the 54 brothers burned in a field outside Paris in a single day in May 1310 for the crime of taking back their own words, and the last hour of Jacques de Molay on an island in the Seine in March 1314. And the words he is supposed to have said there, and the strange fact that both the king and the pope were dead within the year. And I will tell you which parts of that are archive and which are legend, as I have tonight. But for now, stay a moment at the bottom of the stair. The man with the lamp has asked his question, and you have not answered, and he does not mind. He has all night. He sets the lamp down on the stone, where it makes a small warm circle, and steps back. And now you can see that the chamber is larger than you thought, and that there are others sitting against the walls, quite still, in white, and no one is looking at you. There is nothing in the middle of the room. Whatever they came down here to attend to, it is not an object, and it is not on a table. And the space where you expected it to be is simply empty, and the emptiness is the point. We have spent 3 nights underground, and we have been looking at a word, Baphomet, and at a head, and at a sealed room, and at the possibility that men in white mantles sat in circles in the cold, and practiced something for which the 14th century had no vocabulary. Tonight we come up out of the crypt into the daylight, and we discover something that ought to be the most famous fact in this entire story, and somehow almost never is. Here it is. In the 7 years between the arrests and the end, the charge of the idol quietly died. It simply went away. It was the sensation of 1307, the thing that made the whole affair unforgettable, the article that the notaries slowed down to write, the accusation that has kept the word alive for 7 centuries. And by the time the Church of Rome came to make its final formal considered judgment on the order of the temple, the idol had evaporated out of the case like water off warm stone. It is not in the sentence. It is not in the reasoning. Nobody was ever convicted of worshiping it. Nobody was ever burned for it. Keep that in your hand tonight, the way you kept the bread and the horses last night. Because everything that follows is the story of how a case that began with a demon ended with a filing decision, and of what happened to the men caught between those 2 things. Let us go back to the very beginning of it, to the week of the arrests, because the first thing that happened is the thing that decided everything else. Jacques de Molay confessed. He confessed on the 24th of October, 1307, 11 days after his arrest, before an assembly convened at the Temple in Paris, in the presence of the Inquisitor of France and the masters of the University of Paris, and he confessed in a form that must have astonished the room. He admitted the denial of Christ. He admitted the spitting. Not on the cross, he said, but beside it. And then he did something that no royal lawyer could have hoped for, even in his most optimistic draft. The next day, he was brought before an assembly of the university, and he repeated it publicly, and he wrote a letter, or had one written, to all the brothers of the order still at liberty or in custody, urging them to confess as he had done. You must understand what that meant. In the law of the Church, the confession of the Grand Master was not one man's testimony. It was the order testifying against itself. Everything after this, the 7 years, the commissions, the fire, the councils, is an argument with a document that Jacques de Molay signed in the 2nd week of his captivity. Why did he do it? He was 63 years old, or thereabouts. He had been in irons for 11 days. He had been fed the bread and water of a royal prison, which was not the bread and water of the house. He had almost certainly been shown the instruments, which was itself a formal legal stage of interrogation, and often the only one required. Whether he was tortured is disputed. He later said that he had been, and later still said less than that. But there is a second reading of his confession that I want to give you, because it is the reading of a man who knew how the machinery worked. Molay had spent his life inside an institution answerable to one authority on earth, the Pope, not the King of France. The Templars were exempt from every bishop, every prince, every secular court by a bull of 1139 that made them answerable to Rome alone. And Molay knew, he must have known, that what Philip had done was flagrantly illegal. A king had arrested 5,000 religious of an exempt papal order on his own initiative, using his own inquisitor, on his own soil. The Pope would have to react. The Pope could not possibly not react. So imagine an old soldier making a calculation. If I confess to the king's men, the case is complete, and a complete case must go to Rome for judgment. If it goes to Rome, I am before my own judge, in my own court, under my own law, and there I will take it all back. The confession is not surrender. The confession is a transfer of jurisdiction. And here is the extraordinary thing. It very nearly worked, because the Pope did react. Clement V, Bertrand de Goth, a Gascon, a lawyer, a man in permanent poor health who ruled the church from Poitiers and Avignon, and never once set foot in Rome, and who has come down to us in 1,000 books as Philip's poodle, was furious. In late October, he wrote to Philip a letter of real anger, telling him that in seizing persons subject to the Roman Church alone, he had shown contempt, that he had violated every custom, that this was an injury to the Holy See. And then, in November, he did something clever and something quite unlike a poodle. He issued the bull Pastoralis Praeeminentiae, and in it, he ordered every Christian monarch in Europe to arrest the Templars in their own lands, and to hold the persons and the property in the name of the Pope. Look at what that does. On its face, it is a catastrophe for the order. The arrests go Europe-wide. In substance, it is a seizure of the case. Every Templar in England, Aragon, Portugal, Germany, Italy, Cyprus is now a papal prisoner. The King of France's private prosecution has become a proceeding of the Universal Church, and the Universal Church is not Philip's to command. Through the winter and into the summer of 1308, the two of them fought over the bodies of these men, like dogs over a bone, and the fight was conducted in the polite and murderous language of canon lawyers. Philip suspended the inquisitorial proceedings in France because they were now papal, then convened an assembly of the estates at Tours to have the nation declare the Templars guilty, then went to Poitiers in person with a delegation and stood in front of the Pope for weeks. Nogaret, Guillaume de Nogaret, the king's keeper of the seals, a lawyer from the Languedoc, whose own grandparents may have been burned as Cathars, and the same man who 5 years earlier had stormed the papal palace at Anagni and laid hands on Pope Boniface VIII. Nogaret let it be understood that if the Pope proved unhelpful, there were precedents for what happened to unhelpful popes. And in August 1308, in a castle in the Loire Valley, something happened that no historian knew about until the 21st century. I want to tell you about this properly because it is the single most important discovery in the modern study of the Templars, and it was made by a woman reading a badly catalogued box. Clement sent 3 cardinals to the fortress of Chinon, where the highest officers of the order were being held: Jacques de Molay, Geoffroy de Charnay, preceptor of Normandy; Hugues de Perrot, the visitor of France; Geoffroy de Gonville; Rimbaud de Caron. The 5 men at the summit of the pyramid. Between the 17th and the 20th of August, 1308, in a room in that castle, the cardinals questioned them not as prosecutors, but as confessors, and the record was made in duplicate on a great sheet of parchment, and the parchment went into the papal archive, and there it stayed for 693 years. It was misfiled in the 19th century, recatalogued under the wrong number, the way things are lost in every archive on earth, not by conspiracy, but by a tired clerk on a Thursday. And in 2001, an Italian paleographer named Barbara Frall, working in the Vatican secret archives, pulled out a document listed as something else entirely and found herself holding the Chinon parchment. She published it in 2007, 700 years to the year after the arrests. What does it say? It says that the 5 leaders repeated, before the cardinals, versions of the confessions they had made. And it says that having confessed and having asked for pardon, they were granted absolution and formally restored to the sacraments and to the unity of the Church. Absolved. In August 1308, by the direct authority of the Pope, the Grand Master of the Temple was reconciled to the Church. Now be careful with this, because it has been reported in newspapers as the Vatican secretly knew the Templars were innocent, and that is not what it says. Absolution is not acquittal. Absolution presupposes that there was something to absolve. What the parchment shows is a pope treating the affair as a matter of sin and penance rather than of heresy and burning, which is precisely the distinction that decides whether a man dies. Heretics burn, sinners confess, are absolved, and go home. Which raises the question that hangs over the next 6 years like weather. If the leaders were absolved in 1308, why was one of them burned in 1314? The answer is Paris, and the answer is the Retraction, and the answer is a field outside a gate. By 1309, the machinery had split into 2. Clement had established 2 kinds of inquiry: diocesan commissions in every province to try individual brothers for their personal guilt, and a great papal commission sitting in Paris to investigate the order itself as an institution. And the Papal Commission is where this story turns, because the Papal Commission gave the Templars something they had not had since the arrests. It gave them a defense. It opened in the Episcopal Hall in Paris in November 1309, and at first almost nobody came. The commissioners sat and waited, and the accused, when produced, were terrified, bewildered men who had been in cells for 2 years and did not understand what was being offered them. Then, on the 27th of November 1309, they brought in Jacques de Molay. He was asked whether he wished to defend the order, and the old man, 65 now, 2 years in prison, said that he did, but that he was a poor, illiterate knight without counsel, that the order's charters and its wealth had been taken from him, that he had nothing, and that he wondered how anyone expected him to defend the greatest religious order in Christendom out of his own mouth. He asked to be brought before the Pope in person. He said that he was astonished the Church had moved so quickly to destroy the temple when it had taken 32 years to condemn the Emperor Frederick. Twice in that session and a later one, he crossed himself in the middle of the proceedings, a small physical gesture from a man who had run out of arguments. And then the extraordinary thing happened, not from the top of the pyramid, but from the middle of it. In February and March of 1310, the accused began to arrive in numbers, and they began to say that they would defend the order, not 1 or 2. By the end of March, there were nearly 600 of them, and they had organized. They had chosen spokesmen from among themselves, and 2 of those spokesmen were something the king's lawyers had not planned for. They were trained. Pierre de Bologna was the order's own procurator at the papal court, a Templar priest, an educated canonist, a man who knew Roman law and knew how to write a plea. Renaud de Provins was a preceptor and also a man of law. And in the spring of 1310, from inside a royal prison on scraps, these 2 men and their colleagues drafted a defense of the Order of the Temple that is one of the finest documents to survive from the entire affair. I will tell you what was in it, because you deserve to hear it. They said that the order was holy, and that its members were holy, and that the accusations were false. They said, and this is the passage that lifts off the page, that any brother who had confessed to these things had confessed them out of fear, out of torment, out of the loss of hope, or because he had been bribed and suborned, and that the words of such men were worth nothing. They itemized the treatment, that brothers had been confined in latrines and cesspits, that they had been shown the letters of the king, that they had been promised freedom and money to confess, and threatened with fire to keep them from retracting. They said that 36 brothers had died in Paris alone under this treatment, and more elsewhere. They demanded the ordinary rights of any defendant in a church court, that the witnesses be named, that the accused be allowed to hear the evidence, that laymen be excluded from the proceedings, that they be permitted counsel. They asked for the plainest thing in the world, which is that they be tried according to the law. And they made one argument that goes to the heart of everything we have been talking about for 3 nights. They said, if this were the practice of our order, if this denial and this idol were truly our custom, then how is it that not one brother in 200 years ever revealed it? Not one apostate, not one expelled brother, not one man who left in bitterness, not one deathbed confession to a parish priest, in 9,000 houses, in a dozen kingdoms, across 6 generations. Give us that man. Name him. Nobody ever did. That silence from 1119 to 1307 is the strongest evidence the order ever had, and it is still the strongest evidence, and it is why the case against them as an institution finally could not be sustained. For about 6 weeks in the spring of 1310, the defense was winning. And then, on the 11th of May 1310, the Archbishop of Sens convened his provincial council. I need to explain the geography of this because the geography is the crime. Paris in 1310 was not an archdiocese. Paris was a suffragan see under the Metropolitan Archbishopric of Sens. The diocesan commissions, the ones trying individual brothers for personal guilt, were provincial bodies, and the Templars of Paris fell under Sens. And the Archbishop of Sens, since a vacancy conveniently filled the previous year, was a young man named Philippe de Marigny, whose brother was Enguerrand de Marigny, the king's chamberlain and chief minister. The papal commission had no power to stop him. 2 entirely separate legal tracks, 2 different jurisdictions, and the king's men had realized that while the commission could hear the order defended, the provincial council could deal with the men doing the defending. Because here was the trap, and it was a perfect trap, made of pure canon law with no need for any lie at all. Almost every one of the nearly 600 defenders had, in 1307, confessed. Then in 1310, standing before the commission, they retracted those confessions and defended the order. And in the law of the Inquisition, a man who confesses to heresy and is reconciled, and then goes back on his reconciliation, is a relapsed heretic. And for the relapsed, there was no further mercy available. Not because anyone had decided to be cruel, but because the procedure had run out of options. The relapsed were handed to the secular arm. The secular arm burned them. So the retraction that was their only defense was also their death warrant. To defend the order was to convict yourself. On the 12th of May, 1310, 54 brothers of the Temple were taken in carts out of Paris to a field near the Abbey of Saint-Antoine-des-Champs, outside the eastern wall, and there they were burned. I told you I would not linger, and I will not. But there is one detail from that day that I am going to give you, because it is the whole of the truth of these men, and because it comes from a hostile source, which is the best kind. The chroniclers record that they went to their deaths still denying, every one of them. Not one at the stake took back the retraction, and taking it back would have saved him, even then, even in the cart. The formula was available, the reconciliation could have been made, and the fire could have been called off. 54 men in one day were offered their lives in exchange for a sentence, and 54 men declined. The people of Paris, who had watched the whole affair with the enthusiasm of a crowd at a fair, went home that evening and began for the first time to be uneasy. More burnings followed in the following weeks and months, 4 more at Paris, 9 at Senlis, others elsewhere, and the effect on the defense was immediate and total. Men who had come forward withdrew. Pierre de Bologna, the canonist who had written the plea, vanished from the record. He was removed from custody, and it was later said that he had escaped, and no one ever heard of him again, and I would not put much money on the escape. Renaud de Provence was condemned by the Council of Sens to perpetual imprisonment. The Papal Commission, when it resumed at the end of 1310, found that it had almost no one willing to speak. It sat through 1311, took the depositions of some 231 more brothers, most of them broken and compliant, and closed its work in June 1311 by sending its enormous dossier to the Pope. The defense of the Order of the Temple lasted about 10 weeks, and it was ended by a jurisdictional loophole and a field outside a gate. Now, Vienne. The Council of Vienne opened in October 1311 in a town on the Rhone, and it was, on paper, one of the great general councils of the Church. 300 bishops and abbots and archbishops from the whole of Latin Christendom, summoned to decide the fate of the Temple, to plan a new crusade, and to reform the Church. And the first thing it did was refuse to do what it had been summoned for. Clement laid the dossier before the assembled fathers and asked them whether the order should be allowed to defend itself. And the council, by a very large majority, the figure that survives is that only 4 or 5 prelates out of some 300 voted otherwise, said yes. Yes, of course, the order must be heard. That is what law is. There is a moment at Vienne that I love, and it is barely a footnote. In late October, 7 Templars appeared at the gates of the town and announced that they were there to defend the order, and that they spoke for between 1,500 and 2,000 brothers still at large in the mountains of Lyon and elsewhere who were prepared to come and testify. 7 men walked out of hiding and presented themselves to a general council of the Church. Clement, in a panic, had them arrested and imprisoned at once, and forbade anyone to speak to them, and they too disappear from the record. But for a few hours in the autumn of 1311, the Temple came to Vienne to answer for itself. The council would not condemn the order, and Philip would not accept anything less than its abolition, and Clement was caught between a general council and a king with an army, and so he did what lawyers do. He invented a third thing. In February 1312, Philip arrived at Vienne with a large armed retinue. On the 22nd of March 1312, in a secret consistory attended not by the full council, but by the Pope and a hand-picked committee of cardinals, Clement V issued the bull Vox in Excelso. It was read to the council on the 3rd of April, with the King of France seated beside the Pope, and the assembled fathers were forbidden to speak. And here is what it says. This is the sentence that ended the order of the Temple, and I want you to hear its actual words, because almost nobody does. It says that the Pope has considered the infamy, the suspicion, the accusations, the confessions. It says that in the matter of the accusations, proceeding by way of definitive sentence is not permitted, that the case has not been proven in the form the law requires. It says that nevertheless the order has become so gravely scandalized, so defamed, that no honorable man can any longer be expected to enter it, and that it cannot serve God as it was founded to serve him. And therefore, not by judicial sentence, but per viam provisionis, by way of provision, by administrative act, by the plenitude of apostolic power, the order is suppressed, abolished, its name, its habit, its status perpetually forbidden, and anyone who thereafter presumes to enter it or wear its mantle is automatically excommunicate. Do you see what that is? It is an acquittal wearing the clothes of a death sentence. The Church of Rome, given 7 years, 5,000 prisoners, thousands of confessions, a royal treasury, and the full apparatus of the Inquisition, declined to find the Order of the Temple guilty of heresy. It could not do it. The evidence would not carry it, and so it dissolved the order for being too notorious to continue, which is a real reason, and a sad one, and a very modern one. Reputation, not proof. 2 more bulls followed. Ad Providum, in May 1312, gave the Templars property to the Knights Hospitaller of St. John, not to the King of France, who fought a rearguard action for years and extracted enormous expenses from the transfer, but who did not in the end get the estates. And considerantes dudum dealt with the men. And this is the part that surprises everyone. The brothers were to be provided for. Those who had confessed and been reconciled were to receive pensions from the former Templar properties and to live in monasteries, often awkwardly and rather humanly, in their own former houses, now under hospitaller management, with a pension and a garden. Those who had been found innocent were free. Only the unrepentant and the relapsed were left to the provincial councils, and so most of them simply grew old. This is the thing that gets left out of every film. The overwhelming majority of the men arrested in October 1307 were neither burned nor tortured to death, nor vanished into oubliettes. They were released, pensioned, and absorbed. In England, where Edward II had dragged his feet for months and where torture had to be specially imported because English law did not use it, the brothers were dispersed into monasteries with pensions of 4 pence a day, and the order was never condemned. The last of them were still drawing that money in the 1330s. In Germany, the proceedings collapsed almost entirely, and at Mainz the brothers appeared in full armor and were acquitted. In Cyprus they were tried and acquitted, then tried again under pressure. In Aragon they were besieged in their castles for a year. Monzon held out until 1309, and then acquitted by the Council of Tarragona. In Portugal, King Dinis, who had no intention of losing his best soldiers, simply refounded them under a new name, the Order of Christ, which received the Templars' Portuguese property and their surviving brothers, and whose red cross would sail on the sails of Portuguese caravels 2 centuries later down the coast of Africa, round the Cape to India and Brazil. The temple did not end in Portugal. It changed its coat and went to sea. But the men at Chinon were another matter, because the men at Chinon were the ones who had confessed most publicly, and the king needed those confessions to stand. On the 18th of March, 1314, some sources say the 11th, and the date has been argued over for centuries, a commission of 3 cardinals sat on a scaffold in front of Notre Dame in Paris to deliver the final disposition of the 4 surviving leaders of the order. It was a formality. Hugues de Perrot and Geoffroy de Gonville heard themselves sentenced to perpetual imprisonment on the basis of their confessions, and accepted it, and are heard of no more. Then Jacques de Molay stood up. We have an eyewitness, not a friendly one, a Parisian writing in French verse, generally in sympathy with the king, whose chronicle is known as that of Geoffroy de Paris, and who appears to have been standing in the crowd that day. He says that when the sentence was read, the Grand Master rose and, with Geoffroy de Charnay of Normandy beside him, spoke. He said that he had been guilty of one thing only, and it was not heresy. He said he was guilty of having betrayed his order to save his own life. He said the order was pure and holy and Catholic, and that the accusations were lies, and that he had lied when he confessed to them, and that he took it all back, and that he asked the pardon of God and of the Church for having lied. Charney said the same. The cardinals were paralyzed. This was not their jurisdiction anymore. They had discharged their commission the moment the sentence was read. They handed the two men over to the provost of Paris for safekeeping until the morning, intending no doubt to take advice. They did not get the morning. Word reached the king in the palace on the Ile de la Cité, a few hundred yards away, and Philip the Fair did not consult his lawyers, and did not consult the cardinals, and did not wait. He took counsel, the chronicler says, with certain of his household, and before vespers he gave the order. The two men were relapsed heretics who had convicted themselves out of their own mouths in front of the whole of Paris, and the penalty for that was fixed and required no trial at all. That evening they were taken out onto a small island in the Seine. It was called the Ile aux Juifs, a little spit of land just west of the royal gardens, downstream of the palace, a place where the city kept its firewood and its goats. It is not there anymore, or rather it is. It was joined to the tip of the Ile de la Cité in the 17th century, and it is now under the Square du Vert Galant, the small triangular park at the western point of the island, below the statue of Henri IV, where couples sit on the grass in the evening with bottles of wine and look at the water going by on both sides. You have probably seen photographs of it. It is one of the pleasantest places in Paris. 2 stakes were set up, and here the chronicler gives us the detail I promised you, the quiet thing, and it is why I have brought you all this way. Molay asked to have his hands untied so that he could fold them in prayer, and he asked to be turned to face the Cathedral of Notre Dame, which stood at the other end of the island in the last of the light. And then he said, and Geoffroy de Paris, who did not like the Templars, who was standing there in the crowd, who had no reason at all to invent it, wrote it down, that he wished it to be known that he died a Christian and a member of the Church, and that God knew who was in the wrong and had sinned, and that misfortune would come soon to those who had condemned them wrongly. And the chronicler says the fire was slow. He says the two men bore it with such composure, with such steadiness, and so little crying out, that the crowd on the banks was astonished and dismayed, and that afterwards, in the night, people came out to the island in boats and gathered up the ashes to keep as relics. That is the end of the Order of the Temple. 2 old men on a woodyard island at dusk, one of them asking to be turned around so he could see a church. Now, the curse. You know the curse. Everybody knows the curse. Mole, in the flames, summons Pope Clement to appear before the tribunal of God within 40 days, and King Philip within the year, and calls down destruction on the whole line of Capet to the 13th generation. It is magnificent. It is in 100 books and half a dozen films. It is the reason people believe the Templars had dark powers, and since we have spent 3 nights on the question of Templar magic, we must deal with it honestly. The first thing to say is that the deaths are real. This is not legend. This is the calendar. And it is genuinely uncanny. Clement V died on the 20th of April, 1314, about a month after the burning, of a long illness, probably cancer of the bowel, which had been killing him slowly for years and which everyone knew about. He died at Roquemaure on the Rhône while being carried home to Gascony to die. His body was laid out in a church overnight, and the church caught fire, and the corpse was badly burned. That is recorded. Guillaume de Nogare, the architect of the whole affair, was already dead. He died in the spring of 1313, of nothing in particular. Philip IV died on the 29th of November, 1314. He was 46. He had been out hunting in the forest of Halat, near Pontoise, and was taken ill. A stroke, most likely, or possibly a fall from his horse followed by a stroke, and he lingered some weeks and then died at Fontainebleau, where he had been born. He had been in perfect health. Nobody expected it, and the chroniclers, who had all been in Paris in March, noticed. Enguerrand de Marigny, the king's chamberlain, whose brother had convened the Council of Sons that burned the 54, was arrested within months of Philip's death, tried on charges including sorcery, and hanged at Montfaucon in April 1315. And the dynasty. Philip left 3 grown sons, which in the 14th century was security itself. Louis X reigned 18 months and died in 1316, aged 26. His posthumous son, Jean I, lived 5 days. Philip V reigned 6 years and died in 1322, aged 29, leaving only daughters. Charles IV reigned 6 years and died in 1328, aged 33, leaving only daughters. In 14 years, the direct Capetian line, which had passed from father to son without interruption for 341 years, the longest unbroken royal succession in Europe, was extinguished. The crown went to a cousin of the House of Valois. The King of England claimed it through his mother, and out of that came the 100 Years' War. All of that is history. Every date is documented, and it is small wonder that the people of France, and later the whole of Europe, looked at that 14-year cascade and said, "The old man on the island did that." But here is the second thing to say, and I am afraid it is decisive. Geoffroy de Paris, our eyewitness, the man in the crowd, does not report a curse. He reports what I told you, that God knows who has sinned, and that misfortune will come soon to those who have wrongly condemned them. That is not a summons, and it is not a spell. That is a dying man saying you will be sorry, which is the most human sentence in the world, and which every wrongly condemned person in history has said in some form. The 40 days and a year formula, the naming of Clement and Philip, the 13 generations, none of that appears in any source close to the event. It grows. You can watch it grow over centuries, like a coat of paint applied one thin layer at a time. A hint in a 14th century Italian chronicle here, an elaboration in a 15th century German one there. A full dress speech in an 18th century Masonic history, and then the whole magnificent thing set in its final form in the 19th century, when Europe was in love with the idea of secret societies and doomed orders. The version most people know is essentially romantic literature. Its most influential modern telling is a series of French novels from the 1950s, Maurice Drouin's Les Rois Maudits, The Accursed Kings, which is a masterpiece, and which is fiction, and which is where the curse in its present form principally lives. So the deaths were real, and the curse was written afterwards. Both of those statements are true, and they are not in conflict. This is, in fact, the exact same shape as everything we have looked at for 4 nights, and I want you to notice the pattern, because the pattern is the real subject of this whole story. Something genuinely strange happens. A word is muttered in a cell. 5 men are absolved in a castle. 54 men refuse to save their own lives in a field. A dynasty 300 years old dies in 14 years. And then, over the following centuries, human beings come along and build on that strangeness, because we cannot leave strangeness alone. We give the muttered word a face and horns. We give the dying man a curse in formal verse. We give the accidental gap in an archive a conspiracy. And the astonishing thing, the thing that keeps me in this profession, is that the built structure and the true foundation are usually made of the same material, and the joint between them is nearly invisible, and you can only find it by going and looking at the parchment. Which brings us, at the last, back to the head. Where did it go? The reliquary from the Paris inventory, the silver-gilt woman's head, the bones in the white linen and the red gauze, the little label reading Caput 58M, appears in the record once, in 1307, and never again. It is not in the transfer schedules to the Hospitallers. It is not in any later French royal inventory. It is not in the great relic collections of Paris. It was almost certainly melted. That is the ordinary fate of silver-gilt objects in the hands of a treasury with debts. And Philip's treasury had spectacular debts, and he had already debased the coinage twice and expelled the Jews and the Lombard bankers to get his hands on money. The most likely truth is dull and complete. The most famous object in the history of the temple went into a crucible in about 1313 and came out as coins, and somebody bought bread with it, and nobody wrote it down. And the accusation? The idol, the head, Baphomet? It is not in Vox in Excelso. Read the bull. The specific charges are gestured at as the accusations and the infamy, and the Pope explicitly declines to pronounce on them. The individual diocesan sentences turn on the denial of Christ and on illicit absolution, not on idolatry. In England, the final compromise formula that the Templars were made to accept in 1311 was that they could not purge themselves of the fame of the crimes, the reputation, not that they had committed them. In Aragon, in Germany, in Cyprus, in Portugal, the idol charge simply never took root at all. The whole of the demonic apparatus that has fascinated the world for 700 years was a French royal prosecution theory that the wider church, given 7 years to examine it, quietly declined to endorse. The head was never found. The word was never dropped. Sit with that a moment, because it is the strangest fact in this entire story, and it is the door into tomorrow night. The physical object vanished into a furnace, the legal charge dissolved in a papal chancery, and the word, a scribal mangling, possibly of Muhammad's name, possibly of an Arabic phrase for the father of understanding, possibly of wisdom herself, walked out of that burning field and out of that dissolved case and went on walking through the silence of the 15th century into the German cathedral workshops and the stonemasons' lodges into the 18th century, when men in Paris and Edinburgh and Charleston began claiming descent from the temple and building rituals of degrees and passwords, and when a word appeared in those rituals that we have not yet spoken in these 5 nights, though I put it in the title on the first evening, and you may have wondered when I would come to it. Boaz, Boz, the name of the left-hand pillar of Solomon's temple, from the Book of Kings, the pillar of strength, and one of the oldest and most guarded words in the whole of Freemasonry. Tomorrow, the last night, we follow the word out of the fire. We will look at what really happened between 1314 and 1717, and at the 4 centuries of silence in the middle, which are the most interesting silence in European history. We will look at how the temple was resurrected as an idea by people who had never seen a Templar, and why they needed it. We will look at Eliphas Levi again, and at what he was actually doing in 1856, and at the man who came after him and made Baphomet infamous on purpose. And we will finish gently with the question you have been holding since the first night without quite putting it into words. Not was it true, but why does it not go away? For now, though, let me leave you where we left them, because the last image of tonight ought to be a kind one, and this one is. It is the evening of the 18th of March, 1314, and the fire on the little island has gone out, and the crowd on both banks has thinned and gone home to supper. The river is doing what the Seine does, going by on both sides without any opinion. The bells of Notre Dame ring compline at the far end of the island, the same office that had been sung in every commandery in Europe at the same hour for 180 years, by men in white mantles before they shut the door. And in the dark, quietly, without permission, people are coming out in small boats. Ordinary Parisians, the same city that had cheered in 1307, kneeling in the ash with their sleeves pushed up, gathering it into cloths and cups and hats, because they have decided on their own authority, without a single bishop's leave, that whatever was burned here today was holy. They were not scholars. They had no access to the archive. They had watched the whole 7 years from the street, and they had heard the confessions read out in the squares, and they had seen 54 men choose the fire over a lie, and at the end of it they made up their own minds. And their verdict, reached by boat in the dark on an island of firewood, turned out to be almost exactly the verdict that a Vatican paleographer would reach from a misfiled parchment 693 years later. It has been in the title since the first evening. Boz and the demons. You have had 4 nights of demons: the head, the goat, the threshold, the fire. And not once have I told you what Boz is. That was deliberate, and it was not a trick. It is because the word does not belong to the 14th century at all. It could not be spoken in its place until the order was dead and buried and 400 years cold. Tonight it can be spoken, and when it is, the whole shape of these 5 nights will turn over in your hands like a coin, and you will see the other face of it. So the beginning of the end, which is the silence. Jacques de Molay burned in March 1314. The next unambiguous, documented, verifiable claim by anybody, anywhere, to be carrying on the tradition of the Knights Templar comes in the middle of the 18th century. 430 years, give or take. And in that gap, and I want you to feel the size of it because everything tonight depends on feeling the size of it. The Black Death kills perhaps a third of Europe. The 100 Years' War begins and ends. Constantinople falls. Gutenberg prints. Columbus sails. Luther nails his theses to a door, and the Western Church splits in half forever. Copernicus moves the earth. Galileo is tried. The 30 Years' War empties whole provinces of Germany. Newton writes the Principia. All of that fits inside the silence. That is how long it is. And in all of it, in 4 centuries of the most thoroughly documented, litigated, taxed, and written about societies in human history, there is no Templar order, no Lodge of Survivors, no underground chapter, nothing. And this matters enormously because every claim of Templar continuity that exists today has to cross that gap. And the gap is not a stream you can step over. It is an ocean. Now let me be precise because precision is the only kindness available here. Templars survived? Of course they did. 15,000 men do not evaporate. We know exactly what happened to a great many of them because pension rolls are the most boring and most truthful documents ever produced by human beings, and pension rolls survive. In England, they were dispersed into monasteries on 4p a day, and some of them were still collecting it in the 1330s. Elderly men in the corner of somebody else's cloister with a story nobody wanted to hear. In Germany, some joined the Teutonic Knights and went east to fight in Prussia. In Spain, King Jaume II of Aragon created an entirely new order, the Order of Montesa. In 1317, largely staffed by former Templars, to hold the Valencian frontier. Because a king with a border does not throw away trained cavalry over a French lawsuit. And in Portugal, as I told you last night, King Dinis did the thing that makes the whole affair look, in hindsight, like precisely what it was. He negotiated with the Pope for 5 years and in 1319 obtained the creation of the Ordem de Cristo, the Order of Christ, which received the Templars' Portuguese castles, the Templars' Portuguese revenues, and the Templars' Portuguese brothers, including a good number of the men who had ridden out of Tomar in 1307. The order simply changed its name and kept its address. Its headquarters remained the Templar convent at Tomar, which stands there today. And if you go, you can walk into the Carola, the 16-sided rotunda the Templars raised in the 12th century in imitation of the Holy Sepulchre, and then out through halls where the Order of Christ added Manueline stonework 200 years later. A continuous building, continuously occupied, no gap at all. And in the 15th century, the Grand Master of that order was a prince called Henry, whom we call Henry the Navigator, and the order's revenues went into the ships and the Red Cross of the Order of Christ, which is the Templar cross with a slim white cross laid over it, went onto the sails. It is on the sails of Vasco da Gama's ships at Calicut. It is on the sails at Brazil. Christopher Columbus, who married into a Portuguese seafaring family and knew exactly what he was doing, painted crosses of that form on the sails of the Santa Maria, the Pinta, and the Niña. So here is your genuine Templar survival, fully documented, no cipher required. The cross of the temple went round the Cape of Good Hope. It did not go into a vault under a chapel in Scotland. It went to sea, on wages, with a royal license and an accountant. Which brings us to Scotland. And I must be gentle here, because some of you love these stories, and I am about to take 2 of them away. I will give you something better in exchange. I always do. The first story is Bannockburn. It says that in June 1314, 3 months after Mole burned, Robert the Bruce was losing the Battle of Bannockburn when a body of fugitive Templar knights appeared on the field under their Beauseant banner and broke the English line, and that in gratitude Bruce sheltered the order in Scotland forever after. It is a wonderful story. It appears nowhere before the late 18th century. Not in Barber's Bruce, the great verse chronicle of Robert the Bruce written within living memory of the battle by a man who never met a detail he didn't want to include. Not in any English account, not in any Scottish account for 450 years. And the actual Scottish record contains something rather awkward for it. In November 1309, 2 Templars were tried in Holyrood, in Edinburgh, in the ordinary way, by the ordinary papal process, and the Scottish Templar properties were subsequently transferred to the Hospitallers in the ordinary way, and the paperwork is dull and complete. Scotland did not shelter the order. Scotland processed it like everywhere else, only more slowly and with less enthusiasm, which is very Scottish. The second story is Rosslyn Chapel, and this one I have to take away with real regret, because Rosslyn is genuinely one of the most extraordinary buildings in Europe, and it deserves better than what has been done to it. Rosslyn was founded in 1446 by William Sinclair, 3rd Earl of Orkney, as a collegiate church, a chantry, essentially, an engine for saying masses for his soul and his family's. Construction began in the 1450s. That is 132 years after Jacques de Molay died. It was never finished. Only the choir was built, which is why it looks so strange, so dense, like a fragment of something much larger. And it is carved to a degree that has no real parallel in Britain. Every surface, every boss, every capital, more than 100 green men peering out of the foliage, a pillar of spiraling stone that generations of visitors have called the Apprentice Pillar, and a barrel vault of carved stars and flowers and a moon and a sun. None of the Templar readings of it are older than the 20th century, and most are much younger than that. The maze theory, that certain carvings depict New World maize and cactus decades before Columbus, proving pre-Columbian Sinclair voyages, falls apart when you look at the carvings, which are stylized plants of a kind found in stonework all over late Gothic Europe, and which look like maize in the way clouds look like faces. The musical cubes, a theory that the cubes on the Lady Chapel arches encode a melody, depends on selecting which cubes to read, in which order, and on ignoring the fact that many were recut by Victorian restorers. The Holy Grail under the Apprentice Pillar. Ground-penetrating radar and repeated investigation have found the Sinclair family vaults, which is what a family chapel has under it. And the sealed vaults were opened more than once in the 19th and 20th centuries. There were Sinclairs in them. I know, I am sorry. But now let me give you the trade I promised, because this is the part that no film ever bothers with, and it is far more interesting than a grail. Rosslyn does contain Masonic imagery. It really does. And not vague hints either. There is a carving usually read as a blindfolded man kneeling between 2 pillars with a cord about his neck, which any Freemason on earth would recognize instantly as a candidate in the first degree. That carving is real and it is very old, but it points the other way. The Sinclairs of Roslin were, in the 17th century, hereditary patrons and protectors of the stonemason's craft of Scotland. We have the documents, the St. Clair Charters of about 1601 and 1628, in which the working masons of Scotland, actual men who cut actual stone for a living, acknowledge the Sinclair family as their patrons. Scotland is the place where operative stonemasons' lodges first began admitting non-masons, gentlemen, accepted members. The earliest recorded such admission is 1634 at the Lodge of Edinburgh. The earliest surviving lodge minutes in the world are Scottish, from 1599. Scotland is, by any reasonable reading of the evidence, the cradle of Freemasonry. So the connection between Roslin and Freemasonry is not a secret. It is a family business. And the carvings are not Templar ciphers smuggled into a chapel. They are the ordinary self-expression of the actual living craft of masons and their patrons in the country where that craft was becoming something more than a craft. Which is a truer and stranger story. Not knights hiding treasure, but stonecutters slowly inventing a philosophy in a building where they had cut every single leaf by hand. And that is where the word comes from. That is where I can finally tell you about Boss. Turn to the first book of Kings, chapter 7. It is the account of the building of Solomon's temple in Jerusalem, and it is one of the oldest pieces of technical writing in the Bible. A builder's specification, obsessed with dimensions and materials in the way builders always have been. And in it, there is a craftsman, Hiram of Tyre, a worker in bronze, a widow's son, brought from Phoenicia because the Israelites did not have his skill. And Hiram cast 2 great hollow pillars of bronze, 18 cubits high, with capitals of lily work and pomegranates and chain work, and he sets them up in the porch of the temple, one to the right hand and one to the left. And then comes the verse that has echoed for 3,000 years, because it does something the Bible almost never does. It gives the pillars names. And he set up the pillars in the porch of the temple, and he set up the right pillar, and called the name thereof Jachin. And he set up the left pillar, and called the name thereof Boaz. Jachin, from a Hebrew root meaning to establish, to make firm. He shall establish. And Boaz, most often read as in him is strength, or by strength. Establishment and strength, standing on either side of the entrance to the holiest building in the ancient Near East, and nobody in 3 millennia has been entirely sure what they were for. They were not structural. The text describes them as freestanding before the porch, holding up nothing. They were pure meaning. 2 hollow bronze columns, whose only function was to be walked between. The pillars are destroyed. Nebuchadnezzar's men broke them up in 587 BC and carried the bronze to Babylon. The book of Jeremiah records the inventory with a kind of numb precision, because a scribe was standing there watching it happen. But the names survived. And here is the thread that runs the whole length of tonight. In the ritual of Freemasonry, as it emerges into daylight in the early 18th century, the 2 pillars stand at the entrance of the lodge, and the words Boaz and Jachin are given to the candidate, one in the first degree and one in the second, as the words by which he proves he has passed through. They were, for a very long time, among the most closely guarded words in the Western world, words that grown men swore terrible oaths never to write down, and largely didn't, for generations. Boaz spoken in a room in Edinburgh in 1700 was a serious matter, which means that when 18th century men began to imagine that they had inherited something from the Knights Templar, the word waiting at the door of their lodge was already 3,000 years old and was the name of a pillar of the Temple of Solomon, the building on whose ruins the Knights of the Temple had made their headquarters and from which they took their name. Do you see the loop? Nobody planned it. It is the most beautiful accident in the whole of European symbolism. A Phoenician bronze worker names 2 columns. Babylonians melt them down. 2,000 years later, 9 French knights are quartered in the ruins of that site by a king of Jerusalem and take their name from it and become the richest order in Christendom and are destroyed. 400 years after that, Scottish stonemasons, men whose entire professional mythology descends from Hiram and his pillars, because who else would a stonemason claim as an ancestor, begin admitting gentlemen to their lodges. And the gentlemen, looking for a nobler ancestry than tradesmen, reach for the knights, and the knights and the pillars turn out to have come from the same hill. Now let me tell you how the knights got into the lodge, because we can date it almost to the month. The first Grand Lodge is formed in London in 1717, or thereabouts. 4 old lodges meeting at the Goose and Gridiron Ale House in St. Paul's Churchyard, and 3 other taverns, and deciding to constitute themselves. In 1723, James Anderson publishes the Constitutions, the first printed history and rulebook of the fraternity. And in Anderson's history, which traces the craft from Adam through Noah, Euclid, Solomon, Augustus, and the Gothic cathedrals, there is not one single word about the Knights Templar. Not one. In the founding document of organized Freemasonry, the Templars do not exist. 14 years later, on the 21st of March, 1737, in Paris, a Scottish Jacobite exile named Andrew Michael Ramsay, the Chevalier Ramsay, a man of letters, tutor to the son of the exiled Stuart Clermont, delivers an oration to the Masons of Paris. And in it, he says something new. He says that the fraternity did not descend from stonecutters at all, heaven forbid, how vulgar, but from the Crusaders, from noble knights in the Holy Land who formed a fraternity to rebuild the temple, and who brought the order back to Europe, and to Scotland in particular. Ramsay did not say Templar, he said Crusaders, and he mentioned the Knights of St. John. But he had opened the door and pointed at the corridor, and in the Europe of 1737, full of exiled Jacobites, minor nobility with more pedigree than income, and lodges competing for prestige, the corridor filled up in 20 years. By the 1750s in Germany, a young nobleman named Karl Gotthelf von Hund und Altengrotkau is telling a story. He says that while in Paris, he was initiated into a secret higher order by men he could not name, presided over by an unknown superior he calls a Knight of the Red Feather, and that this order is the surviving Templars, and that Jacques de Molay, before his death, secretly transmitted his authority to a successor, and that the succession has continued unbroken in Scotland ever since. He founds a system on it, the stricte observance, the strict observance, which sweeps German Freemasonry and dominates it for 30 years. Von Hun spends the rest of his life waiting for his unknown superiors to make contact again. They never do. He dies in 1776, still insisting he had told the truth. And the strange thing, the human thing, is that he probably had. He was almost certainly the victim of a hoax by Jacobite exiles, or of his own hopeful memory of a flattering evening in Paris. The strict observance collapsed at a great congress at Wilhelmsbad in 1782, when it finally became impossible to avoid the fact that no evidence existed for any of it. And then, in 1804, in Paris, a physician named Bernard Raymond Fabre-Palaprat produced the document to end all documents, the Charter of Larmenius. It is a single sheet in cipher, purporting to be written in 1324 by Johannes Marcus Larmenius of Jerusalem, recording that Jacques de Molay had transmitted the Grand Mastership to him in secret before his death, followed by the signatures of every Grand Master in the unbroken succession from 1324 to the present day, ending with Fabre-Palaprat himself. It is a forgery. It has been known to be a forgery for a very long time, and the reasons are almost funny. The names in the succession list are drawn from the great families of France in a suspiciously 18th century pattern. The cipher is not a medieval cipher. The Latin is not 14th century Latin. And, most damningly, the list includes among its secret Grand Masters men whose real lives are extremely well documented and who were demonstrably busy doing other things. I tell you all of this not to be a spoilsport. I tell you because of what these men were actually doing, which is more touching than fraud. Look at the century they lived in. The 18th century was pulling the floor out from under Europe. The church was losing its monopoly on the invisible world. Reason was ascendant, and reason is magnificent, but it is cold, and it does not tell you what to do with your grief or your awe or the feeling you get in an old building at dusk. And these men, merchants, doctors, minor nobles, army officers, a great many of them thoughtful and sincere, were reaching for something. They wanted a lineage. They wanted to belong to something older and deeper than a tavern club. They wanted the world to have hidden rooms in it. And so they went looking through history for ancestors. And what they found was the Templars. A real order, genuinely secretive, genuinely destroyed by a corrupt king and a compliant pope, genuinely accused of possessing hidden knowledge, and, crucially, silent. Dead orders make excellent ancestors. They never contradict you. The Templars did not survive into Freemasonry. Freemasonry adopted the Templars posthumously without asking 4 centuries after their death, because it needed a father. And once adopted, they were given a job. Because here is the thing that fascinates me most about all of it. In the Masonic degrees that grew up around this idea, Jacques de Molay is not a magician. He is not an occultist or a sorcerer or a keeper of forbidden things. He is a martyr for fidelity. He is the man who kept faith under torture, who refused at the end to leave a lie standing about his brothers. The 18th century took the most notorious accused heretic in European history and made him a symbol of integrity. It read the records, the retraction on the scaffold, the 54 in the field, the men who chose the fire over the formula, and drew exactly the conclusion the Parisians in the rowing boats had drawn on the night of the 18th of March, 1314. So who put the horns back on? We met him already on the second night, but now we can see what he was doing. Eliphas Lévy, born Alphonse Louis Constant in 1810, the son of a Paris shoemaker, trained for the priesthood at Saint-Sulpice, and who left before ordination because he could not accept celibacy. A socialist agitator who went to prison twice for his pamphlets. A failed marriage, a dead child, a life of genuine hardship. He was not a fraud, and he was not a devil worshipper. He was a man who had lost the church and could not lose God, and who spent his life trying to build a bridge back. And in 1856, in Dogme et Rituel de la Haute Magie, he drew the figure. And I want you to hear in his own terms what he thought he was drawing. He said explicitly that this was not the devil. He said it was the pantheistic and magical figure of the Absolute, that the torch above the head represented the equilibrating intelligence of the triad, that the goat's head was the sign of the reproductive powers of the earth, that the two arms, one pointing up and one down, corresponded to the words solve and coagula, dissolve and combine, the two halves of the alchemical work. On the forearms, he wrote them in Latin. He was drawing a diagram of balance, light and dark, male and female, above and below, held in one form. He believed the Templars had understood something like this, and that it had been misread by their persecutors as devil worship, because a church that had lost its own mystical tradition could no longer recognize one when it saw it. He was almost certainly wrong about the Templars. He was working from the trial records with no critical apparatus, in an age before modern editions, and he wanted the connection to be there. But the drawing was so complete, so internally coherent, so exactly the sort of thing a symbol ought to look like, that it did what great images do. It detached from its author and went to work. And within 30 years, it had been stolen from him and turned inside out. The man who did it was not a Satanist. He was a French journalist and professional liar named Gabriel Jogan-Pagès, who wrote under the name Léo Taxil, and what he perpetrated between 1885 and 1897 is one of the most successful hoaxes in history. Taxil, a former anti-clerical pornographer, announced a dramatic conversion to Catholicism and then spent 12 years publishing revelations of what Freemasons actually got up to. He invented an entire secret order within Masonry called Palladism, with Lucifer at its head and Albert Pike of Charleston as its pontiff. He invented a heroine, Diana Vaughan, a former Palladist high priestess turned Catholic penitent, who published memoirs full of Baphomet, demonic apparitions, and sacrilege. Bishops praised the books. The Vatican received Taxil in audience. An anti-Masonic Congress in Trento in 1896 debated Diana Vaughan's existence. On the 19th of April, 1897, at a packed hall in the Geographical Society in Paris, having advertised that Diana Vaughan herself would finally appear, Léo Taxil took the stage and announced that there was no Diana Vaughan, that there was no Palladism, that he had invented the whole thing, that it had taken 12 years, and that he thanked the clergy of France for their assistance. The audience tried to attack him. He escaped through a side door and lived comfortably on the proceeds. But it was too late. The picture had stuck. Baphomet, Lévy's careful diagram of equilibrium, was now, in the popular imagination of the whole Western world, the goat-headed idol of a satanic conspiracy, and no amount of confession could put it back. Taxil had done in 12 years what the Inquisitors of 1307 failed to do in 7. He had made the Templars' idol into the devil in the mind of everybody permanently. After that, the rest follows almost mechanically. Aleister Crowley, in the early 20th century, took Baphomet as his own magical name in the Ordo Templi Orientis, deliberately, provocatively, because he liked the horror it produced and because he had read his Levi and knew what it actually meant. In 1966, Anton LaVey founded the Church of Satan in San Francisco and adopted as its emblem the inverted pentagram with a goat's head inside it, which became known as the Sigil of Baphomet, a design element, not a theology. And in 2014, the Satanic Temple, which is an atheist organization whose entire method is legal argument by symbol, unveiled a bronze Baphomet statue, 8.5 feet tall, and began offering to install it beside 10 Commandments monuments on American public land, on the perfectly sound constitutional principle that a government which platforms one religion must platform all of them, which is how a scribal error in a French torture chamber in 1307 ended up as a plaintiff's exhibit in 21st century American church-state litigation. If you had told Guillaume de Nogaret, he would not have believed you, and he would have been right not to. It is completely absurd. It is also exactly what happened. So, we have come up out of the crypt. Let me now do the thing I promised you on the very first night, which is to tell you plainly what I think. I do not think the Knights Templar worshipped a demon. The evidence is not there, and I do not mean that it is thin. I mean that it collapses when handled. Every element of the demonic case was produced inside a French royal prosecution by torture from a pre-written list of articles, and it failed to reproduce anywhere the torture was absent. Aragon, acquitted. Germany, acquitted in armor. Cyprus, acquitted. Ireland, Scotland, England, no idol, no conviction for idolatry, pensions. That is not the signature of a real practice. A real practice leaves the same fingerprint everywhere. Torture leaves the fingerprint of the torturer. I think the order almost certainly had something in its reception ceremony that was strange, and that this was not nothing. Too many men said it too consistently in places where the questioner had not planted it, and the phrase aurait non corde had to come from somewhere. My honest reconstruction, and I offer it as reconstruction, not as fact, is that some houses, at some periods, practiced a hard rite of testing on the night of profession, and that its meaning was either a soldier's rehearsal for capture or a mystic's shattering of the image, or both in different houses, and that most of the men who underwent it never understood it and carried it as shame for the rest of their lives. And I think the head was a reliquary, one of thousands, revered as such reliquaries were, and misremembered under duress into 100 contradictory monsters. And I think, this is the part I hold most firmly, that men who rose before dawn, fasted 3 days in the week, sat in silence and cold, in stone rooms filled with resinous smoke, and had given away everything they owned and every future they might have had, saw things, not because they had a demon, because that is what human consciousness does under those conditions, in every century, in every religion, on every continent. The Templars had built, without necessarily intending to, a very effective machine for altering the human mind, and the name of that machine was ordinary monastic discipline, and it was running in 10,000 houses across Europe, and nobody thought it worth remarking on because everybody was doing it. That is the real dark magic of the order. It is not dark, and it is not magic. It is what a person becomes when they subtract almost everything. But there is one more question, the one you have been carrying since the first night without saying it. And it is not, was it true? We have settled that as far as it can be settled. The question is the other one. Why does it not go away? 700 years. A word that a clerk could not spell, spoken by starving men in a Paris cellar, about an object that was melted into coins before anyone could look at it, in a case that the church itself declined to prove. It should have died with the pension rolls. Instead, it has been the pillar of Masonic imagination, the hinge of a 12-year hoax, the name of a magician, the emblem of a San Francisco church, the exhibit in an American courthouse, and the reason two of us are still awake at this hour. I have thought about this for a long time, and here is the best answer I have. Because the story is shaped exactly like a doorway, and human beings cannot walk past a doorway. Every element of it is an aperture, a sealed room whose contents were never recorded, a word with no agreed meaning, an object listed once and never seen again, a parchment misfiled for 693 years and then found. 4 centuries of silence with nothing in them, a gap and a gap and a gap. And a mind confronted with a gap does not experience it as absence. It experiences it as invitation. That is not a flaw in us. It is the same faculty that makes us build and grieve and pray and do history at all. The impulse that makes a man in 1737 invent a lineage of knights, and the impulse that makes a paleographer in 2001 keep pulling boxes off a shelf are the same impulse wearing different discipline. One of them fills the gap with what it wishes were there. The other goes and looks, and I love them both, if I am honest with you, though only one of them can be trusted. And so the last thing I want to leave you with is not a mystery. You have had 4 nights of mysteries, and you have been very patient. The last thing is a small, true, verifiable fact, and I have saved it for the end of the whole cycle because it is the only ending that does the story justice. Somewhere in the Vatican archives, in the ordinary course of an ordinary working week, a woman was checking a catalog entry that did not match its box. That is all. No revelation, no descent into a vault, no candle. Just the daily, unglamorous monastic labor of a person going carefully through documents that thousands had walked past, doing the boring thing properly. And out of that came the news, 700 years late, that on a summer afternoon in August 1308, in a room in a castle on the Vienne, 5 exhausted old men in the custody of a king were quietly told by 3 cardinals that they were forgiven and could receive the sacraments again. They probably thought it meant nothing. 2 of them were burned 6 years later anyway. Nobody outside that room ever knew. The parchment was rolled and tied and shelved and then misshelved, and it sat in the dark through the Renaissance and the Reformation and the Enlightenment and the Terror and 2 world wars, holding on to its one piece of good news, waiting for somebody methodical enough to find it. That is the actual magic in this story, and it turns out not to be dark at all. It is that nothing is ever quite lost. not the pillar names of a Phoenician bronze worker, not a shepherd's son's word for what he did with his mouth and not his heart, not an old man asking to be turned to face a cathedral, not a misnumbered sheet of parchment in a box on a shelf. It waits. It is extraordinarily patient, and every so often somebody who is paying attention picks it up, and a small true thing comes back into the light. The lamp is nearly out now, and that is quite right, because we are finished. Somewhere in Portugal there is a 16-sided rotunda that has never once stood empty. Somewhere in Scotland there is a chapel where a stonecutter carved 100 green men and one blindfolded candidate between two pillars, and signed none of it. At the western tip of an island in the Seine, there is a triangular scrap of park where 2 men were burned, and where tonight someone is sitting on the grass in the dark, watching the river split around them without the faintest idea, and it does not matter in the least. Whatever was in the crypt is not down there anymore. It came up the stairs with us, and it is only this, that people are worth listening to carefully, especially when they are frightened, and especially when what they say cannot be proved, and that the gaps in the record are not doors into darkness, but simply places where somebody has not looked yet. You have been a very good listener for 5 nights. Nothing in that room ever wanted to frighten you, and nothing in it has followed us out. Sleep well. The stair will still be there, and it will keep.